Hello to all of the real progressives out there. Thank you so much for tuning in today. We have a fantastic show for everybody. I have some more interviews with some real progressives colleagues. Our founder and CEO, Steve Grumbine, sat down to discuss the race to the bottom with me. We're going to be bringing in our co-editor-in-chief, Jabari Morris, to discuss MMT and federal versus states funding and more about the race to the bottom. Also did an interview with Jodi Newell, who's an activist and host of the Up and Up on Real Progress in Action, talking about the opioid crisis and how Big Pharma kind of gets away with literal murder. And how the media misframes that issue. So really excited to bring you guys everything that we have to talk about today. Want to start with some RP plugs. Go to realprogressives.org. If you want to learn more or support our organization, we have all sorts of fantastic articles and things there, some of which I'm going to be using today. Make sure you're not missing out on any of our great content. Our Patreon is also there if you'd like to contribute. Follow us at Real Progress US, at RP_in_action, and I am at Luke Parcher Show if you want to follow me. So just to go ahead and dive right in here, crazy story in my view is this whole OnlyFans situation. OnlyFans obviously built their brand on sex workers and are now, deciding that they've exploited them enough and they're going to fuck them over. OnlyFans is banning sexually explicit content. Yes, really. The OnlyFans ban will begin on October 1st, but no word on what qualifies as explicit and what becomes of creators. This is in Gizmodo. OnlyFans is kicking potentially millions of small entrepreneurs to the curb by placing new limits on the types of content it will allow on its platform, namely the content that made you know what OnlyFans is in the first place. OnlyFans said Thursday that it will abandon porn, the rock on which it built its house, the tinder which ignited its hearth. The news was first reported by Bloomberg. In a statement emailed to Gizmodo, OnlyFans said that the company will be prohibiting sexually explicit content starting October 1st. They did not define sexually explicit, but added that nudity, in keeping with its acceptable use policy, will still be allowed. The policy currently bans public nudity from locations that don't allow it, but we expect an update. Quote, in order to ensure the long-term sustainability of the platform and to continue to host an inclusive community of creators and fans, we must evolve our content guidelines. What really happened here, actually, I'll go on with the next paragraph because this is relevant. This comes just off a recent Axios report that OnlyFans, with a net revenue of $375 million, has struggled to find investors willing to back a porn platform. Its existing creators, on the other hand, have been raking a ton of money to the site, according to Axios. OnlyFans paid out $3.2 billion to creators since its founding. They've also made its founder, Tim Stokely, spectacularly rich. As of April, OnlyFans had reached over 120 million users. I've seen numbers citing even higher, 130. So, guys, there's two issues at hand here. First of all, the stigmatization of sex work is one issue that that banks are so unwilling to touch any company that engages in sexually explicit content. That's one thing. We should not stigmatize sex workers. They are workers. We should certainly protect them, and we certainly shouldn't economically force people into sex work who don't want to do it. But people who want to engage in this work ought to be able to without any trouble, legal or otherwise. The other issue here is a more broad one, which is that corporations will exploit and take advantage of workers to their own ends and then fuck those workers over at the first expedient opportunity to do so. So OnlyFans here gets rich off of sex workers, gets rich off of being a porn platform, and then turns around and says, yeah, no more of that. We can't get any banks to invest. How egregious, how horrendous, how repulsive. It's outrageous to me. And I'd also note, you guys, this is a very slippery slope legally. The Supreme Court a long time ago basically ruled that they would not define porn. They just said you'll know it when you see it. Well, OnlyFans here refuses to define sexually explicit. So what's sexually explicit, you guys? Let's go down the rabbit hole for just a second. There's a scene of two people going from G to X rated very slowly. At what point does the camera have to turn off? I think we all accept that, like, cuddling and kissing is not sexually explicit. It's not porn. Okay. If they start getting handsy, is that when the camera has to turn off? When clothes come off, is that when the camera has to turn off? At what point are you now defining this as sexually explicit content? And at what point is nudity just a naked person? Is a a provocative pose considered sexually explicit, or is that just a naked person sitting there naked? You see what kind of nonsense you get yourself into, and what kind of subjectivity you get yourself into, and what kind of leeway a corporation has to define these things however it wants to in its own short-term to its own short-term best interest. This is quite a rabbit hole, and it will undoubtedly be used to attain the financial backing that OnlyFans wants, to the detriment of the very workers who built this company up. This is just outrageous. This is egregious. I really don't know what else to say about it. And to those of you who like take issue with this kind of content, or take issue with OnlyFans' original business model, guess what the great thing about content you don't like is? You don't have to fucking watch it. There's plenty of TV shows out there that I think are stupid, that I don't enjoy. There's plenty of books and literature and music and games that I don't personally enjoy, but that others do. Guess what? I don't have to ban it or oppose it. I can say, great, I'm thrilled that someone else enjoys that content. I'm going to choose not to watch it. So if you oppose what OnlyFans does, guess what? No one's forcing you to watch it. So shut the fuck up. Let someone make their money and let someone else enjoy their content. What's the problem? I thought this was freedom. I thought this was America. It's amazing to me how the very people who like to use those talking points will turn around and hand wring endlessly about something that they consider to be undecent. Who cares whether you like this content or not? Who cares? That's not the point. That argument could be applied to almost anything, right? So this is a sad story. There are many people who were making a decent living through OnlyFans as sex workers, which again, we should not stigmatize, who will now be forced to reevaluate their finances and find a new way of making income. And OnlyFans gets to benefit from their labor, exploit their labor, and then go out and get the investments that they want once they were big enough to do so. So shame on OnlyFans here, engaging in the very exploitation that we talk about quite regularly, but doing so in an even more egregious way, by playing off of the stigmatization of sex work after they built their brand on sex work and on porn. Shame on OnlyFans. Absolutely ridiculous. And I hope that this ends up causing enough backlash that they are forced into reevaluating, though I doubt that will be the case. Banks, you guys have this stranglehold over things in the country. There was similar issues came up when we were in the early stages of states legalizing marijuana, where banks would not do business with marijuana retailers. And it's really problematic and illogical to have these billionaire banking shareholders and investors and CEOs and executives deciding what is morally okay in our society because they actually have the financial leverage to make a difference in this regard. You or I really can't, like people will say, vote with your dollars. We really can't in many cases. You go to the grocery store and it's 3 exploitative companies that have 18 different brands, and then you go pick one of them. You really can't make these kinds of choices. You really cannot use your financial influence to alter the morals or ethics or whatever of our society or of pop culture. Banks have that kind of leverage, especially when they act together in unison, and it's usually to an oppressive end, right? It's usually something like this, where they're arbitrarily deciding that this particular form of content is not decent or not acceptable for them, and therefore they end up screwing over the workers with their financial leverage. It's sad the power that we give banks. It's sad how we stigmatize various groups in our society, sex workers being one of them. All of this is wrong, all of it. So shame on OnlyFans. And I hope that this either is undone or that another site pops up that provides these workers the ability to make a living, because they ought to have that dignity and respect that everybody else in our society also ought to be afforded. So Moving on here to the next huge story as of late, obviously, Afghanistan and the media's endless miscoverage and hand-wringing about Afghanistan. So I want to start off with a major caveat. I, in no way, am okay with the way that women are treated by the Taliban. There are many places around the world where women or ethnic groups or religious groups or impoverished communities or on and on are mistreated and discriminated against and oppressed. Many places in the world, okay? And I oppose it vehemently. I do not think the U.S. military should be involved in all of those locations, and I think you're a complete and total fool if you think that the U.S. military is engaging in various locations because of human rights or because of what would happen to the women if it weren't for their presence. So it's a very convenient flipping of the coverage. Is anybody under the impression that when we went into Afghanistan, it was to save women? Anybody under that impression? If you are, I've got a bridge to sell you. That's not why we were there. We were not there. That wasn't even our stated reason for being there, let alone the real one. And I'm going to get to an article on Real Progressives later here momentarily that goes into some of this. But to be exceptionally clear, just extraordinarily clear, we are not involved in innumerable places around the world where women are oppressed and have their rights violated. We are close allies with Saudi Arabia, who treats women about as bad as any country in the world. Saudi Arabia is basically the Taliban as a country. Okay, it's a far-right Wahhabi interpretation of the Quran that literally guides their legal system. So if we want to talk about human rights, if we want to talk about protecting women, why are we allied with Saudi Arabia? Right? Have you seen the media at all discussing how Israel treats girls in Palestine? Have you seen any of this? The horror, the humanity. Well, of course, the horror, the humanity. No one's disagreeing with that. It's the discrepancy in coverage that's worth pointing out. Has anyone hand-wrung about the inhumanity that we inflict upon the countries that we have sanctions on, going back to George Bush Sr. and Bill Clinton really escalated them? Decades worth of these sanctions in Iran, Cuba, Venezuela, etc., that disallow medical supplies from being sent to those communities. Do you see any hand-wringing from the media about how we're creating an inhumane situation for the civilians of these countries? Of course you don't. Of course you don't. Do you hear anyone talking about Yemen and what happens to civilians, women and children in Yemen because of our political decisions, because of our foreign policy, because of our support for the Saudi genocide in Yemen? Do you hear any of that? Of course you don't, because the media are massive fucking hypocrites. And they only utilize this kind of reporting when it is expedient to defend the military-industrial complex and defend the state. So again, I want to be extraordinarily clear. I in no way support the Taliban. I in no way support how they treat women. I think what we're seeing right now in in Afghanistan is horrendous. It's awful. I would take it. I would undo it if I had the power to. However, the point is, it is not our withdrawal that causes this. We could withdraw in 10 years, or we could have withdrawn 10 years ago, and the result would be damn near identical. Now, if you want to go around the edges and find nuanced ways in which we could have withdrawn better, fine. That's fine. But do not make the argument. Do not make the argument that this is happening because we are withdrawing. You'll make a fool out of yourself. And that's what the media is trying to do. Believe it or not, Nicole Wallace, of all people, who literally helped lie us into these wars as press secretary for George W. Bush, she even came out and said what Biden said the other day: 95% of the country will agree with, and 95% of the media will disagree with. Now, she's obviously exaggerating for effect, but she's exactly right. The press attacks anything that is perceived as anti-war, while the voters, the constituents, have long been in favor of getting out of these unnecessary offensive wars for resources and for propping up the military-industrial complex. I have a clip here that I'd like to share with you guys really quickly that goes into some of the details from the Afghanistan Papers, which was a leak about U.S. officials and how we really felt about the Afghanistan efforts. So this is, I'm sorry, what's the guy's name? Craig Whitlock. Craig Whitlock wrote a book about the Afghanistan Papers and Afghanistan more broadly. He went on Breaking Points to discuss some of the details coming out of the Afghanistan Papers. We'll watch this clip and then come back and discuss.
Honored to be joined now by Craig Whitlock. He's a journalist at the Washington Post, author of a new book on the Afghanistan Papers. It's called The Afghanistan Papers, A Secret History of the War. August 31st, 2021 is when it gets published. I'm encouraging everybody to go out there and buy it. Craig, thank you so much for joining us. You've been one of the foremost journalists on the front of revealing the lies of so much of the Pentagon has been telling the American public about Afghanistan. Obviously, that is very salient, given the situation right now in Kabul. Can you just take us through your original report on the Afghanistan Papers and the major revelations that were within that, and how they relate to the situation on the ground in that country right now?
Yeah, thank you. I think they do help explain what's going on there now. It's awful what people are seeing in Afghanistan and in Kabul, but there's been a lot that's been leading up to it. The Afghanistan Papers are a series of interviews that the government had done with senior, mid-level, all sorts of hundreds of people who were key figures in the war over 20 years. The Washington Post had to sue the government under the Freedom of Information Act to obtain transcripts and notes of these interviews. And it took us 3 years to get our hands on them. And what they showed was that what the public version of what was going on in Afghanistan, what the government was telling the public, the American people, was always upbeat, was always rosy. And yet in these confidential interviews that they had done, it was just astonishing to see how pessimistic they were about the war. You had ambassadors, you had generals saying, we didn't know what we were doing. We didn't have any fundamental understanding of Afghanistan. We didn't have a strategy. Our strategy was a mess. And this went on for 3 presidents. So again, the total contrast between what the American people were being told about the war, which was that we were winning or that victory was around the corner, and these private comments where they were saying the complete opposite.
Wow. I want to underscore what you're saying there, which is that they were knowingly telling the American people, for example, the surge is working. And they were privately saying, directly, we were manipulating every single statistic here. And even when we tried to manipulate them or cherry pick which statistic we were going to put out, they still painted a grim picture. You know, one of the things that I would love for you to talk about is the big question has been like, why did the government fall so quickly? Why did the Afghan army deteriorate so quickly? I thought there was a pretty relevant quote here from Ryan Crocker, who's been telling the press lately that, you know, the way that the exit happened is an indelible stain on the Biden presidency. Privately, former ambassador to Afghanistan under President Obama said, our biggest single project, sadly and inadvertently, of course, may have been the development of mass corruption. And it strikes me that's a very important piece of information for understanding why this government clearly had very little public support and why it collapsed almost instantaneously.
Yeah, there's another relevant quote from Ambassador Crocker in the Afghanistan Papers where he was asked about the Afghan National Police, which is really a paramilitary police force. These aren't beat cops. These are pretty similar to soldiers. But he said Ambassador Crocker called the Afghan police useless as a security force. And he said the reason they were useless is because they were corrupt down to the patrol level, that they preyed on the population. And I think that was an accurate assessment. They were useless as a security force, and the Afghan population hated the police because the police always shook them down for bribes or did nothing to protect them. But, that goes a long way to explaining why, the Afghan security forces, as you said, just melted away. They didn't have the support of the population. And they kind of had their fingers to the wind when it became clear that the Taliban was going to come out victorious.
One thing I'm curious about, Craig, in all of your reporting and all of this, was there any attempt in order to apologize for how these people behaved? I mean, I see so many quotes in major national papers today from officials who are on the record in your stories telling the public a different one. There doesn't seem to be a lot of reckoning, even in the same way that there was in the post-Vietnam era, with what actually happened in Afghanistan and the lies that the American people were told?
It's a really good point. There weren't many apologies. Frankly, there was one. There was an interview with Ambassador Nicholas Burns. He was a longtime diplomat. He was ambassador to NATO during the Bush administration. And he, very bluntly said, looking back, we never really, figured out when we were going to leave. What were we doing there and what criteria would we have that would enable us to leave Afghanistan? He says, I don't ever recall having a discussion about that at the highest levels of the Bush administration. And he said, and part of that's on me. I'm along with everybody else. I played a role in this, and we do need to have, some kind of reckoning and accounting for what happened there. And he was talking about a time frame 15 years ago. But so I think he was reflective about that. But, yes, you're right. By and large, very, very few people who were interviewed in the Afghanistan Papers had that level of contrition or reflection for what's gone on.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought that was an informative clip there. For those who haven't, seen reporting on the Afghanistan Papers, it was a pretty devastating look into what the United States actually thought about the situation, that we were there for years with the highest officials knowing full well that we were there for nothing. And I want to quickly, 2 points I want to touch on here. First, I want to there's this notion or this sort of smear job that is done against those of us who think that these wars are almost entirely unnecessary and offensive and designed to prop up the military-industrial complex. Those of us who argue we should get out of these wars. And that smear is to try to portray us as against the troops, as though we are somehow dishonoring or besmirching the troops who have lost their lives or lost limbs or come back with PTSD, lost friends overseas, etc. And I want to make sure that this point is made. Those who are supporting the troops are those who are saying we should not send them over there to die for nothing. We should not send them over there to be injured gravely and come back with PTSD. We're supporting the troops. If you're arguing that we should send them over to these places arbitrarily for resource acquisition and to maintain contracts to Raytheon and Boeing and General Dynamics and Northrop Grumman and Lockheed Martin and all these defense contractors, if you're arguing that we should be sacrificing lives for that cause, you are the one who does not support the troops. Take your flag lapel off and own your position. Do not try to smear us as anti-troop. We are the ones trying to save their fucking lives. Okay? And if you think hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Afghani and Iraqi lives are worth the outcome that you just saw, you're insane or cruel or both. Okay? What we've just seen in Afghanistan is proving us anti-war activists entirely correct, that this 20 years was for absolutely nothing. You're seeing it now. What did we do in 20 years? We made Afghanistan less stable. We made the Taliban more powerful and other extremist groups more powerful. That's what we did. For what? For what? So I wanted to address that point quickly. And I also want to talk about how we propped up corruption, you guys. We took like warlords and put them in power as puppets and then expected that this was going to somehow create a unified, government, competent government that could defend itself when we left. Well, it's like clearly the fighters we had trained, which also exaggerated, by the way. Biden says we trained 300,000 fighters. It's likely more like 50,000 or something that actually were going to stick it out. Well, a lot of those people probably ran because, like, look at this corrupt shit show that the United States has put in charge of our country. And now when they see the spout cut off, it's like, well, I'm not going to sit here and fight the Taliban, right? Of course this was going to happen. Of course this was going to happen. It was 20 years for nothing. And the president, I'm drawing a blank on his name, Ashraf something I want to say. Anyway, the puppet that we had installed, essentially ran and allegedly took $169 million in cash as he ran. This is the government that the United States installed and thought was going to competently replace us when we left, effectively, in terms of security forces. You heard him there explaining that the security forces were deemed to be an absolute joke, even by the American forces that were supposedly training them and getting them ready to defend the country themselves. So in every possible way, getting out of Afghanistan is the right thing to do. Now, I do not want to overpraise Biden, because while in a vacuum, leaving Afghanistan is probably the most courageous foreign policy decision that's been made by a president in quite some time. He severely misframed the issue, and more importantly, he contributed to us being there in the first place. He was one of the core contributors to us being there in the first place. In the early 2000s, Joe Biden was one of the loudest voices on the Democratic side of the aisle pushing for the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. So he brought his caucus along to support this absolute shit show. So you got to keep that context in mind as we evaluate his decision to withdraw. He also severely misframed it, and we're going to get into. I'll go ahead and show you guys this article here. This is from Real Progressives. Make sure you're checking out realprogressives.org for all sorts of great articles and content. This is by Birian Sandal. Afghanistan, war for capitalist rights, not human rights. In his speech to the nation on August 16th, President Joe Biden lied. He said, "I've argued for many years that our mission should be narrowly focused on counterterrorism, not counterinsurgency or nation building. The United States does not fight wars for counterterrorism, nation building, or human rights." It's not what it is. Birian's completely correct here. The purpose of the United States government is and has always been to defend the capitalist system, whether through legislation or military action. The endless wars fought by the U.S. are capitalist wars. Afghanistan is no different, and a withdrawal from Afghanistan does not indicate a fundamental change in U.S. foreign policy. A common defense of the Afghanistan war is painted around women's rights. After the collapse of the Afghanistan puppet government, CNN reported it took days for the Taliban to seize Afghanistan and potentially erase 20 years of gains for Afghan women. The Atlantic published an article entitled "The Taliban's Return is Catastrophic for Women." NBC News wrote, "The Taliban has taken control of Afghanistan, plunging the nation into a humanitarian crisis that is particularly dangerous for the country's 14 million women and girls." These stories push a narrative that does not tell the full story and defend the brutal imperialism of the United States as if it were a crusade for women's rights. These same outlets have been largely silent on the U.S.-backed war Saudi Arabia is waging in Yemen, which the UN considers the largest humanitarian crisis on the planet. I want to encourage you guys to read the rest of that article. It's an absolutely fantastic piece. We are not there for women. We never were, okay? And again, caveat, nobody wants to see what happens to women under the Taliban and under other theocratic authorities. Nobody wants to see that. That's not the issue. The issue is, are we going to send our military to every fucking country around the world who mistreats women or mistreats children or engages in human rights abuses? Of course we're not. And more importantly, we contribute to human rights abuses on a routine basis, as I laid out earlier in the stream. So if you're not going to hand-wring about the way Israel treats civilians, if you're not going to hand-wring about what our sanctions have done to Cuba, Venezuela, Iran, and others, if you're not going to hand-wring about what we are supporting in Yemen, then shut the fuck up about Afghanistan. Seriously, especially if your argument is in the context of this is the United States military's responsibility. It's absurd. It's desperate is what it is. The media is grasping for any narrative that it can find to try to support maintaining these endless wars. You guys go look at the stocks. Go look at how much in the last 20 years a Boeing or a General Dynamics or a Lockheed Martin has made. That is what this is honestly about. That is what we're doing. We're propping up our domestic economy, and we're directing the vast majority of those funds to a bunch of shareholders and CEOs who make missiles and airplanes for a living. That's what we're doing. And to portray this as a women's issue is disingenuous and dishonest and misrepresenting what we actually were doing there. And it also overlooks, you guys, when literally some of the puppets that we propped up were engaging in sex trafficking. Did you hear any hand-wringing from the media about that? It got about a day's worth of half-ass coverage. Did you hear any hand-wringing about, oh my God, look at what we're doing to women. Look at what we're propping up in Afghanistan. What that means for Afghan women and women in the region. No, not a fucking word. What did we do to Libya? What's Libya like right now because of our intervention? Like we could endlessly, I could do an entire stream about this alone. And yet the media hyper focuses in whenever it can use one of these narratives to try to prop up the military industrial complex and maintain a forever war. So do not for half a second believe what these imperialist propagandists are trying to tell you with almost everything that they do. Great piece from Birion. Make sure you're going to realprogressives.org to find all of our fantastic work. So I want to show you guys a clip here. I interviewed earlier this morning Jodi Newell. Jodi is an activist with Real Progressives, and she hosts the Up and Up on Real Progress in Action, where she interviews other activists and platforms other activists and talks about activism. It's a fantastic show. Drops on Fridays. If you're not catching it already, make sure not to miss it. So this was Jodi and I talking about the opioid epidemic and the way Big Pharma literally gets away with murder out of pure rapaciousness and how the media misframes the issue, all these kinds of things. Enjoy. I'm very happy to be here today with Jodi Newell. Jodi is host of the Up and Up on Real Progress in Action and is with Real Progressive. She's here to talk a little bit about the opioid epidemic and the way that Big Pharma has handled it and the way that the media has covered it. Jodi, thank you so much for taking the time to be here today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Luke.
So do you just want to start by maybe explaining a little bit about what the latest update here is with the Sackler family and what's going on with the lawsuits against them?
Sure. There are actually a variety of lawsuits happening right now and settlements coming together, and it's all around the opiate crisis. So the Sackler family is central to this situation because they were in control of Purdue Pharma. And so Purdue Pharma, of course, was the manufacturer, originator essentially of OxyContin, started putting that out, and in a variety of ways, they took advantage of their position in being a credible pharmaceutical company, spreading lies essentially about misinformation about the drug itself, about OxyContin. It was actually advertised as explicitly as something that was non-addictive or less addictive. So it was portrayed that way to doctors, and that was kind of the essential lie. And then from that, when they realized that there were issues, when they realized that there were copious amounts of drugs going into very small places. I mean, we heard the classic story about McDowell County. I think we all kind of acknowledge that is millions and millions of pills going for a small amount of people, obviously in an economically disadvantaged area that had kind of been economically decimated. I guess that's the right word, devastated or decimated because of, the coal and that kind of thing, things changing in their traditional, means of making a living, that being gone. So it's a ripe place for people to be prone to, to addiction and substance use issues. And it was explicitly marketed in a wrong way. And then on top of that, when they realized that it was being abused and that their system was being taken, being used to dump millions and millions of pills into these places, they continued to do that. That was actually on the advice of McKinsey, the McKinsey group, which I know you guys are probably all familiar with. I first heard about it, because of Buttigieg during that run, and that he had worked with them, and we kind of realized the bad things that they do. Well, this is another extremely horrible thing that they were involved in. There's separate litigation going on about them. All of this litigation is going into settlements, which allows people to skirt their responsibility and things like that. So that's what's happening now. So right now, all of these settlements are coming together over the past, I would say, year. This is since, this has really been coming together and settlements being proposed. And the latest thing to come out is that the Sackler family has refused to sign off on their portion of the $26 billion settlement that is explicitly Purdue Pharma, and the Sackler family putting, what was it, 4.3, I believe, $billion into that. They're refusing to sign off on it because they want to make sure that they have immunity personally, so that they personally, individuals who are heavily involved in the decision making and all of these things, and there's evidence of this, has been shown. They were explicitly, intimately involved, and they want to have no liability. So that's what's the
Absolutely
holdup
unbelievable.
now, is they're saying, no, we won't sign off on this unless we get personal immunity and cannot be
Leveraging their wealth for
for
prosecutorial immunity. Unbelievable. And actually, you mentioned the McKinsey situation. That's one of the instances where that became very clear, because they were actually asking McKinsey specifically to consult on how do we get ourselves out of this mess? How do we cover up what we've done here? But just very quickly before we dive into the media clip and talk about the media coverage, can you just talk a little bit about, some people may recognize this point from Professor Anthony Zankis, who joined our coverage of the March for Medicare for All. He talked about the experiments that led to the phrase, it's the cage, it's not the substance. Can you just talk a little bit about how addiction is such a problem here, in large part because of our societal and political and economic decisions?
Yeah, absolutely. We see this we see this highly correlated with areas that are economically disadvantaged. I love that you had that this was talked about on your show. I remember commenting it on YouTube. Thank you so much for talking about this, because the way that we frame substance use is extremely, it's wrong. It's wrong. We have stigmatized, we have criminalized, we have stigmatized. We have, personally, we have made this an issue of morality, where we judge someone's morality based on whether or not they have a substance use issue. Of course, there are a lot of things that stem from that are, actual, theft and things like that come from the substance use and the chemical need for more. And that is true. But essentially, the problem itself is based on socioeconomic conditions. People are not prone to it unless the conditions are set. And so what it is our society has basically set the conditions for this epidemic, for people to be vulnerable to substance use, and then of course taking it too far. And so that experiment, essentially at first, so what it was they gave, just to kind of recap a little bit in case people missed the first one, what it is they put rats in a cage, and they said, all right, so here's this rat in a cage, and we're going to give it two sources of water. One is going to be clean water, the other one is going to have an opiate, and it was heroin. And so this is going to have this in it, right? And so it was to judge whether or not a rat, was prone to the same kind of substance use addiction, right? And what it did, of course, that's what the rat did. So once the rat tried both of them, found the one with heroin in it, it kept going back to the heroin, But what they did later was they ended up changing the cage. So they put things in the cage that were, something for the rat to do. Spin on a wheel, for example, right? Just something for it to do. Gave it a mate, right? Someone that it could, be there. It was not isolated anymore. Now it was surrounded by other rats and things like this. And they did the exact same experiment with the water and with that had heroin in it. And it didn't go back to it so much. I believe they said it was like 20% actually continued to go back to it. So much, much less than what they experienced in the first place. And really the lesson from that is these are the conditions that you put, I know these are rats, but you put people, it's the same with people. You put them in a situation, you create the conditions for them to want to do that. But what we do with substance use is we not only criminalize it in the first place, but then when we, when that person is found out for and things like this, we isolate people. We take away their sense of community. We criminalize them. We think that they are horrible people. We associate morality with the thing. So what we're doing is the exact wrong thing. We're exacerbating the problem that created the conditions in the first place for people to be prone to it. And I think what it really is going to take, why I appreciate so much when people talk about this and really highlight it in this way, is that this needs to be a fundamental change of our perspective, right? Not only, and a lot of times people, propose solutions that are through the criminal justice system. And it's like, yes, thank you for having that bit of compassion, where you're going to have that understanding, where you say, okay, we need to divert people from, but is still in the criminal justice system, which is not where it needs to be. Many studies that I read, I've done a whole lot of research on this. You know that I have the personal experience of I lost my children's father to heroin addiction. And so I watched that. And so for years, I've been trying to analyze what was it that happened? This is a great kid from a great family, guy from a great family. He's just starting a family. This is, we were in love. We were going to get married. These seem to be good things. And so for me to kind of analyze what has happened, and I've done a lot of research to it on top of that in the past, 4 or 5 years. And what you'll find is that essentially what people say is that we need to treat it like a health issue, that it is the most, best correlation that people make is, this is, analogy is this is like diabetes, right? It is something that it is a physical issue, it's a health issue. And yes, it's based on the things that you do. Diabetes, type 2 diabetes is based on your behavior. This is and so the change needs to be behavior change. It needs to be behavioral change and things like that. And so it depends on what people do. You know what I mean? I feel like I'm not putting it right, but you understand what I'm saying.
No, I think you're putting it very well.
And it needs to be a management system where you. Right.
Yes. And those can be macro societal issues in the sense that if a poor community largely has access to shitty food, you're going to end up with more type 2 So these aren't like individual personal responsibility arguments. They're macro sociological arguments. And I just to add to the point, like
so much better than I did. I appreciate that. Yes. Thank you.
Listen to you for a while and then I summed it up. But yeah, no, the stigma that you talked about, I think it's also really important to note that there's a very strong classist element to that we don't tend to stigmatize rich addicts. It's seemingly acceptable for, just to use one of the stereotypes, the rich Wall Street banker to drink himself silly and be railing coke on his desk while he's making trades. Perfectly acceptable. We're not going to call him an addict. We're not going to, you know what I mean? But as soon as you're the impoverished addict, now you're the junkie. Now you're the guy on the street. Now you're, so we very much, there's a classist element to this as well. So I want to get on to the specific case here. So we're going to show here, this is a clip from PBS NewsHour. And in some sense, credit to them for covering it and going over some of the details. But we want to show you this clip and then come back and talk about some of the framing and some of the ways that the media has covered this more broadly. So we'll watch this clip and then come back and discuss.
It has taken more than 2 years of negotiations, but a number of states have now agreed to a $26 billion settlement with 3 large drug distributors and Johnson & Johnson for their roles in the opioids epidemic. 500,000 deaths over 2 decades are attributed to the growth of opioids and fatal overdoses. The settlement would release these companies from legal liability. William Brangham has the details.
The 3 distributors, Cardinal Health, AmerisourceBergen, and McKesson, are accused of turning a blind eye to enormous suspect shipments of opioids. They'll pay $21 billion over 18 years. Johnson & Johnson, which made an opioid component, was accused of downplaying the addictive properties of their drugs. It will pay $5 billion over 9 years. Many states must now review the settlement, determine how much they'll get, and then decide if they will sign on. For the record, Johnson & Johnson is a funder of the NewsHour. So let's get some perspective from one of the attorneys general who was involved in these negotiations, William Tong of Connecticut. Attorney General Tong, great to have you back on the NewsHour. In the past, you have been a strong critic of other negotiations and settlements with regards to the opioid crisis. Why do you think this one is a strong one?
This one goes to a significant degree to putting necessary funding for treatment and prevention out to cities and towns and states and families and victims across the country. And people need help right now. Other than the pandemic and the COVID crisis, the worst public health crisis in America is the opioid and addiction crisis. And it claims almost 100,000 lives every year across the country, more than 1,000 people, 1,000 families in Connecticut wrecked every single year by the opioid and addiction crisis. And it does more than $10 billion in damage to our state alone. So we need help now. And this is a huge down payment, I would say, for the coming years for every state and every community to try to manage our way through this crisis.
You touched a bit on what some of the money would be used for. Can you tell us a little bit more how that money would be spent? And just as importantly, how do you protect against it getting diverted to non-addiction related sources?
So by its very terms, this very large settlement will go towards abatement. So this $26 billion deal represents the second largest cash settlement in history of any litigation in American history, exceeded only by the big tobacco settlement over 20 years ago. And we wanted to make sure that that money goes directly to treatment, prevention, addiction science, victims and their families, and helping people through the long road to recovery. So by its terms, it directs that money to treatment and prevention, and it makes sure that that money gets to not just states, but we've made provision in this agreement for cities and towns and municipalities that are on the front lines of this battle.
I mean, the companies themselves still argue that they didn't do anything wrong, that they were making and distributing a legal, authorized product. And the implication is that this avalanche of lawsuits is what forced them to the negotiating table and now to this settlement. What do you make of that argument?
Look, this settlement provides for a good amount and a good deal of accountability and justice for victims and their families. There's not enough money in the world to erase the pain and the suffering that families across this country have endured from the opioid and addiction crisis. And there isn't enough justice that we can produce for each of these families. But this goes, again, a long way to honoring their pain and suffering by funding treatment and prevention and doing everything we can to provide as much justice as we can. The truth is that the three major drug distributors distribute almost all of the prescription drugs in this country, including all the opioid and prescription pain medication. And they played a central role in moving these pills across the country that were often diverted and overprescribed. Johnson & Johnson played a central role in providing material for producing opioid pain medications and producing their own opioid products. And so the facts are there for everyone to see, and this $26 billion settlement is a recognition of the responsibility that the distributors in Johnson & Johnson must take for their role in this crisis.
As I mentioned before, the states still need to look this over and approve it. That's not a guarantee. Do you think that this amount will be enough to persuade them all to buy in and affirm this deal?
Yes, again, I know all the states know that this is the second largest cash settlement in history. They know that we've only done better once before, and that was with tobacco. And they know how hard this has been to negotiate this over several years. There have been many times when it wasn't clear this would happen, and the states persevered, and cities and towns. There are more than 4,000 cases pending now in one courtroom, a federal courtroom in Cleveland, Ohio. It's the multi-district litigation court where all the opioid cases are centrally managed. To resolve a case with 56 states, the territories, and the district, and thousands of private plaintiffs and cities and towns with their own claims is such a huge undertaking that only with the full cooperation of almost all the states and their attorneys general, Democrats, Republicans, and cities and towns and plaintiffs and victims across the country, only with everyone's hard work and combined effort could we get to this point. And so I have a lot of confidence that from this point forward, everyone will see how important a deal this is and that people will embrace it and ratify it.
Separately, as you well know, Purdue Pharmaceuticals, the maker of OxyContin, is in separate negotiations where they will declare bankruptcy, reorganize their corporation, and pay upwards of $4 billion. Some states have been saying, yes, we like the contours of this deal. Where do you come down on that?
I'm a hard no on this deal, and I'm joined by 8 other states who reject this deal because it does not provide enough justice. the Sacklers take no responsibility for their role, their singular role in the opioid and addiction crisis. And this money just isn't enough relative to the amount of pain and damage the Sacklers have caused.
All right, Attorney General William Tong of the state of Connecticut, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
So you guys could see there, they went over some of those details. But Jodi, do you want to maybe explain? First of all, there was quite an admission in that clip in terms of their financing. Can you go over those details and also just kind of explain how the framing is inherently problematic and how the media covers this issue?
Yeah, I think that, right off the bat, hey, I appreciate, at least in this one, that they admitted that they are funded by Johnson & Johnson, which is one of the people who are involved in these settlements, not the same one as Purdue, but in another one, for their own behavior, which is, that in itself, it's amazing to see how many different organizations, how many different corporations were involved in every step of this, full knowingly, you know what I mean? And Johnson & Johnson, we're all like, yay, Johnson & Johnson, we have a vaccine, but this is but this is the flip side. So yes, PBS NewsHour is funded by Johnson & Johnson. I wonder, actually, and I really should look into this, because they did not say that in earlier clips that I saw. That I wonder if they actually started funding PBS when in between. I don't know. I don't know when that started, but you can see in the way that they cover this, what really I thought was really important to note about this clip is that they frame it very much like, first of all, Johnson, for example, Johnson & Johnson, but the Purdue Pharma and all these things, they frame it as if they're too big to fail, essentially. Like what we talked about, like we are so dependent on them for their pharmaceutical for what they provide. Look at it now with the vaccine and things like this. So we're so dependent on this company that we can't, that they can go away because we depend on them as a country to provide us with pharmaceuticals. So first of all, too big to fail. Second of all, removing all personal liability, talking about this, what was the thing they said? And they were talking about how, if we were to continue this would just drag on. There are 4,400, I think it's over 4,000, I'm not sure the exact number, of cases against them, right? And they say, this would take such a long time, and people who have been affected by this need it now. So basically, we are not, we don't have the time and we don't have the capacity to have actual justice. There's another one that's specifically talking about the Sacklers. It's who is it? John does a late night show. Why am I blanking on his name right now? I can't think of his name.
Colbert?
Not Colbert.
One of those. Yeah.
The other one. Anyway, so he's done a few things talking about the opiate crisis and the way things are going. But what's really interesting is he talks about how, the Sackler family moved money so that the money wasn't coming to them. Is now they're getting a bankruptcy plan. All of these things that the way that they're being held accountable. What bothers me is that they're being held accountable and their justice is served in their own language. Right. So it's on their own terms. Right. So we charge them money. It's going to be a settlement now. No one's going to jail. No one's, actually having personal accountability. They are so far removed. So they even actually moved headquarters to White Plains, New York. Okay. And the reason they did that was not because there was anything in White Plains, New York. It was because White Plains, the judicial system in White Plains, New York, was more likely to allow them to have immunity. They call it second party immunity, I think. So they moved their case so that, their headquarters, so that it would be in a place where this case was, where it would be more likely for them to skirt responsibility. Now they've come up with this bankruptcy plan, and they're going to Sacklers are no longer going to have any investment in the thing. In Purdue, they're not going to be involved in Purdue, and Purdue is going to have another name now. It's all of these little tricks that if you have a good attorney and all these kind of things, you can skirt responsibility, and it's very sad. I don't think that people, I've heard people talk about this before, so I actually want to bring it up. In overdose crisis, in the overdose crisis cohort and things like this, and people that I work with on a national level, on this issue, you know, even they will say, hey, we shouldn't, you know, we shouldn't put this in terms of them going to jail and things like that, because then that kind of trickles down to people who are street level dealers. And what street level dealers are basically trying to support their own habit. You know, so when Trump said, oh, we're gonna do the death penalty for people who deal with drugs, that's what we're gonna do, you know, and all this stuff. And I'm just like, what are you talking about? Where are you gonna draw that line? But at the same time, you know, when it's people who on such a broad scale, I mean, we could bring it back to this classic saying, with great power comes great responsibility. And so when we talk about it as being too big to fail, pundits who are supportive of and trying to, you know, kind of run cover for the Sackler family and things like this, they will put it in this frame as if, oh, well, this is for us. It's because we need them and all these kind of things. But at the same time, I look at that same point and I say, yes, they are so powerful, that are so perfect, they do have all of this, then they are even more so should be held responsible for the actions that they have, because there is more harm that they can do.
Yeah,
so it's interesting to me how they flip this on its head, use this same fact pattern, the same thing, and yet they put it in this light as if they're doing us a favor, you know, and this is what it's supposed to be. Whereas when you actually take that and look at it, flip it on its head and look in the exact same fact pattern, you know, it really says that they should be held personally.
Absolutely, yes. You know what? Like, let's take this to any other crime and use that same logic. Should Manson not be prosecuted, because then we'd have to prosecute the people that did his bidding? Like, I mean, imagine someone trying to make this argument in a serious context. But this is what happens with Big Pharma, because they're institutionally protected. It is murder. That's what it is. It's murder. It's assault. It's like however you want to frame it. It's directly harming people's health and people's social lives and people's families. How did it, just to ask you, like, personally, Jodi, do you feel like this is any form of justice for you and others who have had to deal with this crisis in a personal, hands-on way?
I think no. I personally, no, I don't. I don't think that this is justice. I think this is, and essentially because it's put in their terms. I don't think I'm personally going to see any, you know, whatever. And I don't care. Like, I don't want money from it. What I want is for the system to change so that other people do not have to deal with. So we talk about, you know, this has been 500,000 people who have died from this over the last, you know, couple decades. 500,000 people. But I want you to realize that it's not just 500,000 people who are affected by this. This is 500,000 people who were lost to this. And what I really like to focus on, or, you know, call to mind, is that the families that are affected by this. I have 2 little boys. One of them was a year old, was knocking on the bathroom door. And that was what got me to say, what is happening? Because he's not answering. That was my 1-year-old. He was 1 at that time. I was 9 months pregnant. 3 weeks later, I had another son who spent his entire life knowing that his father had passed and all of these things. I did everything I could to remove the stigma, you know, but this is a fatherless son. I know Corey. I know how excited he was to be a dad. I know how good of a dad he was. I know what he's out on. And because I have been with them for all this time, so let me just give an example. My younger son, who was not born at the time, you know, I used to tell all these stories because I wanted to reframe it before people, before the world got their hands on it, right? Before they realized, you know, that this was how he died and had to deal with the stigma. And there is secondary trauma from that, right? On kids, even if they didn't know their dad. Now, here's my, so I would tell stories and all these things so that they could get to know who he was before they knew how he died and were exposed to that. One day, my younger son, I think he was 4 at the time, maybe 5, but, you know, his older brother had been in some of the stories, but Corey was never in the stories. I mean, but Benny was never in some of the stories. So here Benny starts telling stories about things that he did with his dad. Now, I'm a mom, so I'm here for the whole thing. I know that he wasn't even alive then. I know that. But he's telling the story because he feels the loss and he wants to draw some connection with his father. So it's like these are on such a personal level that I don't think we can, what the emotional and what the psychological for the people survivors. What do you call that? And I think the impact of this is not only the people who passed, and rest in peace to all of those people. I'm not trying to diminish that, but I am trying to say that the effect that it has on so many other people. There are tens of millions, maybe hundreds of millions of people in our community who have suffered the secondary trauma from what has happened from that. I think it's way more than we can explicitly quantify. And so no, for money to be put in. And then here's the question, where's that money going to go? Where's that money going to go? Because when they talk about it, like in that clip, they talk about how it's going to go to the police and it's going to go to treatment programs. And to me, I know personally the way that treatment programs for profit have popped up because people understand that there's a here because we have this crisis and it needs to be dealt with. So now people can jump into it. I have personally known people who went into this explicitly to make the horrible way to approach things. And also, going into policing. When you talk about taking it out of the criminal justice system, we need to take it out of the criminal justice system. So there are a lot of policies that can be implemented that would help to prevent. We talk about Medicare for all. Absolutely, it needs to be Medicare for all, and this needs to be put into the medical sphere. Also, jobs guarantee and things like this that support people so that they aren't at rock bottom, that they aren't in this situation where they are vulnerable to substance use issues and things like that. So no, I don't think that this answers the question at all. I do think that they should be held personally accountable for their role that has been proven over and over again. I do think they should be held accountable, but I don't think that that's a magic whatever that's going to fix the whole problem. I think we need to look a lot deeper into it and assess this system that we have that produces this issue.
Yeah, you're very right to distinguish between the two things. We want accountability for the perpetrators, but we also need the systemic change that will stop future perpetrators of their kind from being able to be as successful in harming society for profit. I'm hoping just really quickly here, Jodi, that you can touch a little bit on, you just mentioned that the funds are going to go to police. That would seem to me to be actually contributing more to the problem. Like now we're going to arrest and beat the victims of this crisis. Like logic completely, detached from that decision. That I don't even hardly know what to say to that. Can you just talk a little bit about how harmful that can be?
Yeah. I mean, I think what we do when we keep it in the criminal sphere, one of the things, that I found in my research, there's 3 different kinds of stigma. And stigma is one of the main things that anyone I was talking to in the recovery community talked about, is that is what we need to change. We need to put it into different terms, into the medical terms and the healthcare terms, and also in the stigma that goes along with it being criminalized. So there's social stigma, right? This is societal stigma, right? That is the way that we as a society look at this problem, and so the way that we judge people. Then there's structural stigma, which is the criminalization, which is keeping it how our institutions make system. And then there's internalized things with each other. And what it does is it produces a situation where people are isolated from their community. They are judged, they are ostracized. And yes, this absolutely exacerbates the issue. Not to mention, just in general, the things that we talk about in, the criminal justice system, the issues that we have now, and, the bail system and things like this, people get caught up in that situation and it becomes, a landslide. It just becomes one thing on top of another. Snowball. That's the analogy I'm trying to come with. But it becomes a snowball where you get caught in the criminal justice system. Then you're in there, you lose your job, you lose your kids, you lose your you're more isolated and all these kind of things. And all of those things, like any actual research-based information that we have, is exactly the wrong way to go about it, because it actually exacerbates the problem rather than addressing it.
100% correct. Thank you so much for being here to talk about this. And Jodi, lastly, can you just talk a little bit about the Up and Up, what you do with the Up and Up, and where and when people can find your work?
Yeah, absolutely. So The Up and Up is a show that essentially lifts up activists. I'm an activist myself, and a lot of times you do these actions and you're really advocating for these things and you're putting all this energy and organizing and all this stuff, and yet the mainstream media doesn't cover it. So not a lot of people will see it. So people don't really know what's happening in different areas of the country. They don't know exactly what the issues are. These are things that the mainstream media doesn't want to cover because, let's face it, what is it, 5 media conglomerates at this point? So what I wanted to do with my show is to lift up those people and educate people about what others are doing around the country. So it's for activists by activists, right? So the Up and Up Our show comes out every Friday at noon. Please check it out and support these people who are on there. So yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, it's a great program. If you're not already watching Jodi's show, make sure that you go check it out. And also, I've had her Twitter up here on the screen, but it's Jodi K Newell 21. If you want to follow Jodi on Twitter, make sure you're not missing any of her fantastic content. Jodi, thank you so much for taking the time today.
Thank you, Luke. I really appreciate it.
So I thought that was a really fantastic conversation there, Jodi, telling her personal story and relating it to the bigger picture issue with Big Pharma and the way that the media covers this opioid epidemic. Really want to encourage you all to catch the Up and Up if you haven't. Jodi also did fantastic work for us covering the March for Medicare for All on the ground in DC, getting all sorts of great interviews. She does really fantastic work. Make sure that you're not missing out on Jodi's content. At this point, I'd like to bring in our co-editor-in-chief, Jabari Morris. Jabari is going to talk a little bit of MMT with us and talk a little bit about the race to the bottom and the difference between federal funding and state funding. Jabari, thank you so much for taking the time to be here.
Thank you, Luke. Good to talk to you, brother.
Absolutely. So first of all, I guess before we get into this conversation, can you just talk a little bit about what you guys do with articles and where people can find them and things like that?
Oh, of course. You can find all our articles at realprogressives.org. They're actually any article that you want to find is actually realprogressives.org/written-media. That you also can see them right on the front page. And all our articles are organized according to our 7 knowledge areas that Steve has, of course, talked about many times. And this gives you ability to see the different intersections between how different things work, like intersections between economic justice and ecological justice, equality with justice, peace with justice, always good, technology, innovation, and health.
Yeah. Like there are many issues that may fall in one category or may fall in 5 or 6 categories. Like it's some issues just fall in almost all of them. So you can go find kind of by topic there if you want the various articles. And we're going to read from some clips from one of these articles here momentarily. But Jabari first, and this may be a little bit repetitive, but I don't mind being repetitive on this topic. Can you briefly explain what MMT has taught us about federal spending and how a fiat currency actually operates and what we need the general populace to understand about this?
No problem. MMT, all it tells you is MMT is just what it is. It's currency analysis. It shows you how things operate in any scheme, not just one that might be a currency, quote unquote, sovereign scheme, but even in cases where a scheme isn't currency sovereign. So basically, in an environment like ours in the United States, where we have a fiat currency that is non-convertible and it's not paid to another currency, it means that taxation and spending at the federal level are totally decoupled. In fact, it means the fact that spending at the federal level is creation of new currency, and taxation at the federal level is the elimination of currency.
Yeah, and the implication there policy-wise is that when we're arguing about various social programs that involve fiscal spending, fiscal policy implications, that we need not fearmonger about debts and deficits in an inherent way, right? So can you talk a little bit about what the actual limits or constraints are on our ability to spend on various programs?
Yes, we know what the actual constraints is. The constraints are not monetary. The constraints are all resource based. So that means that in an economy such as ours, as long as we have enough resources, as in raw materials, finished goods and services in order to get things done, then there's not any constraints. The only constraint is inflation, and inflation only comes into play when spending becomes an issue with getting the proper resources.
Yep, absolutely. And then can you contrast that with how local constituencies spend, how a city or a state or a county spends in comparison with the federal government?
Pretty simple. Cities, states, businesses, and regular human beings, we are not the currency issuer. Therefore, we can only spend what we have plus up to however amount we can credit. At the federal level, there is no such thing, because at the federal level, all currency is created. So when it spends, like I said earlier, it creates money. When we spend, we're just circulating money.
Absolutely. And when you talk about decoupling these two arguments, can you explain a little bit? Like, I think we're often sometimes misportrayed as opposing taxing the rich, or opposing holding them to some sort of account and addressing the wealth gap. Can you explain what we mean by decoupling those arguments, and that we don't necessarily support not holding the rich to some sort of account or trying to address the wealth gap?
Oh, certainly. I love if we can get back to the taxation levels of Eisenhower when they taxed them at 90% or higher. There's nothing wrong with that. Just don't tell me that we can't have nice things before we tax them. Mm-hmm. That's the question. Simple as that.
I mean, quite frankly, and Steve, I did an interview with our founder, Steve Grumbine. He said you're empowering those that you tax, and I think that's an interesting way to put it, right? If you're paying for things by taxing a big corporation, you're in a sense empowering that corporation. So can you just give a brief, and then we'll go to Burian's article here and talk a little bit about what he had to say. But can you give a brief explanation of why trying to force states to shoulder the responsibilities of these various social programs and economic programs can be problematic?
Oh, definitely. It's basically part of the race to the bottom. What happens is at the state level, they're relying on taxes and tax bases, right? So if you have a big corporation that comes in and you all of a sudden hike up the tax rate, then that makes them more liable to leave your state. And then when they leave your state, then now your tax base is decreased now. So you try to cut the tax base, they bring in a new company, and then some other state cuts their tax rate, and that new company leaves, and it just keeps going down in a bottomless spiral. It's what you would call the positive feedback loop. So it is, the further you go down, it keeps going down further and further and further.
And I would use, you're in the medical field, and I would ask you to maybe comment on like how this, I think the start of COVID kind of demonstrated some of this. We saw a lot of states making cuts to their Medicaid programs, and Cuomo famously in New York closing hospitals and facilities leading up to and during the beginning of COVID. Can you talk a little bit about how having that financial constraint in a very direct way harms the constituents of the state?
Yes, basically, it makes it impossible to take care of your people the way it needs to be taken care of. When you're in the middle of a crisis, you need to be doing more spending at the state level. However, because you're a currency issuer at the state level, it causes a huge issue, because now you have to you got to rob Peter to pay Tom. So that's why you need the federal government to step in and take care of the situation, because at the federal level, like I said before, and I say again, there is no resource constraint when it comes to money. It's only resource constraint when it comes to goods and services and raw materials.
Absolutely. And there's also a secondary effect on a lot of these programs, Medicare for All being one of them. Medicare for All would, because it's more efficient, be a deflationary program whereby we are losing jobs in the insurance sector. Now, nobody at Real Progressives wants to maintain Aetna or Primera's ability to, steal profits as a middleman in the system. What we're saying is the individual human beings that work at these companies need a job and need not to be left out to dry. So can you talk a little bit about how a state would not be capable of making up for this deflationary pressure in the same way that a federal government would, and how a federal jobs guarantee would work to eliminate some of these issues?
Yes, at the state level, if you were to implement a program such as this by yourself, even if you had the capability, let's say like California or New York State, right? If you had the capability of doing so, you would get rid of the insurance sector. And in doing so, that would eliminate the insurance jobs. And like you said, it's deflationary. So now you have more people unemployed. So that's where the federal job guarantee comes into play, because then it helps to take care of some of these issues in terms of people making sure they have jobs. Also, on top of that, any job that pays more than what we would consider a minimum wage job, we could actually absorb into the federal government and bring them through at a higher wage than even the job guarantee wage, as part of a just transition that a federal job guarantee and the Green New Deal would put into place.
Absolutely. It's one of the most important policies that we're fighting for, in my view, because it Fadl Kaboub talks about the layer cake. And I think that the federal job guarantee in many ways is connective tissue for these various different issues, but by making up for the deflationary pressures that these other policies would bring along. So at this point, I'd like to read a little bit here from an article that Birion wrote. This was back on August 4th. This is again on realprogressives.org. Make sure that you're checking out all of our fantastic articles there. Jabari and Virginia do an absolutely fantastic job keeping everybody informed with these pieces. So I'm just going to read here the first couple of paragraphs, and then we'll ask Jabari to comment on this. Birion here says, I attended the March for Medicare for All in Seattle on Saturday, July 24th. This was one of 56 marches organized across the country by grassroots volunteers. This march was well organized with speakers throughout the day, a car and bicycle escort, and a community-based security system. Medicare for All has wide support throughout the nation. Unfortunately, the turnout for the march was mediocre at best. I estimate a few hundred marched with us. Other towns reported low turnout as well. While it would have been nice to have thousands in the streets in every city, the fact that people turned out across the entire U.S. was impressive. These marches were organized on a local basis with only grassroots support. There was no media coverage. It was only spread through word of mouth and social media. As we know, in the drought-ravaged West, it only takes a spark to start a fire. While the Medicare for All fire Bernie ignited was largely smothered by the DNC, Biden, and other corporate mouthpieces, the movement has not died. I saw some of that passion during the Seattle March. Goes on here to say, if there is one issue the left is united around, it is universal single-payer healthcare. At the Seattle March, I saw members of Democratic Socialists of America, Party for Socialist Liberation, the Green Party, Yellow Vest Action, the People's Party, the International Marxist Tendency, Socialist Alternative, the Black Panther Party, Black Action Coalition, Physicians for National Healthcare, Real Progressives, and numerous local organizations such as Whole Washington, Washington Community Action Network, and Healthcare is a Right Washington. All these organizations have different political outlooks and platforms, but on a sunny Saturday in Seattle, they came together to march for justice in healthcare. There is a beauty in solidarity. He shows some images here and he says, why do we march? Marches such as these bring a greater awareness of the issue of injustice in healthcare and the solution, universal single-payer healthcare. I talked to a man who was drawn to the crowd and wanted to know how Medicare for All was better than Obamacare. I later saw him marching with us. While I didn't get a chance to talk to him later, I expect he will be lending his voice in support of single-payer in the future. He would not have learned about Medicare for All if not for this march. Even if he was the only person influenced, that makes the march a success in my mind. So Birion here making the point that these direct action, direct organization, etc., really does draw attention to the issue in a positive way. Really want to encourage everybody to read the rest of that article on realprogressives.org if you haven't read it yet. But Jabari, can you go into some of the distinctions that Birion drew between, and some of this we were kind of touching on earlier, but the potential for advocating for this stuff at the state level to harm the national cause, and how we're fighting for Medicare for All here, not a compromised Medicare for some kind of a policy. Can you just explain some of those mechanics?
Okay. Well, I'm going to take it from a top level. To be honest, Medicare for All is actually a compromise itself. What we really should be fighting for is an American NHS, in which case that the whole healthcare industry would be nonprofit throughout the whole country. Yes, the doctors would get paid. Yes, any other providers would get paid, but there would be absolutely no profitability around other than the extra people being paid. There would be no middleman. So Medicare for All is a compromise. So state-based procedures, as we talked about before, imperfect because you have certain externalities that a non-currency user can't deal with. So say a recession hits. Now your state is taking in less money. So in order to keep healthcare, you're going to have to cut in some other program. And again, that just leads further and further down the drain to the race to the bottom.
Absolutely. You're left deciding between necessary social programs. And during a recession, those programs would be even more necessary than they already are. So you're having to decide between education or addressing houselessness or healthcare. If you're having to make these choices on the grounds of budget cuts, you're not doing any service to your constituents. And Jabari, can you talk a little bit more broadly? And we talked about this previously when we talked for the march, but being someone who works in healthcare, can you just talk about how desperately we need, like you said, an NHS system really would be ideal, but a Medicare for all, a true robust Medicare for all system would be at least a compromise that takes us a step in the right direction. Can you talk about how these policies would affect everyday people from your perspective working in healthcare?
Okay. Well, the main thing is once you decouple healthcare from people having a job, that makes things so much easier because now you're not forced to work at a job that you don't like anymore because you just want to keep healthcare. Now, if your employer is not a good employer, you can leave and go to another job without having to worry about, oh, can I get a physical? Oh, can I get my medications? Oh, what if I have to go to the hospital? So it definitely gives a lot more freedom when you have programs like this in place.
And then lastly, can you explain what you think our best strategy would be to get to this point? What do we all need to do, whether we're like me with commentating or people who are out at the marches? What can just everyday people do to contribute to this cause and get us towards a more humane healthcare system?
Well, we all have to learn the truth. We can't believe that taxes fund spending at the federal level, first of all, because if we do that, then that automatically kneecaps us in the first place. And we really have to learn how money works. And unfortunately, this system of things teaches us a lie on purpose so that we don't have any idea how to fight together. It purposely divides and conquers us. So we have to learn the truth so that we can get together and we can fight for what we really need. Like I said,
absolutely.
Yeah.
Go ahead. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to cut you off there.
Yeah, like I said, American NHS would be the more optimal policy, but Medicare for all is a minimum acceptable compromise, as one of our writers would love to say.
I like that term, minimal. That has to be kind of established in any given issue. What is worth fighting for? What's worth our time and effort? What is a compromise that actually takes us enough in the right direction? I felt this way about Bernie. Bernie was a compromise for me, but he was enough in the right direction that it was worth our time to fight for it, even though electoral politics is quite dubious, as I think many of us accept. And you just one more question, Jabari. You brought up the division in that last answer. Can you talk about how the tax to spend rhetoric and framework ends up dividing people and how it's used to put political hurdles between us and these policies?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's really simple. If you don't understand how the truth is, then you have to deal with funding mechanisms at the state level. And what that means is there's always going to be the other side saying, oh, how you going to pay for it? Or, oh, you going to tax me more? No, I don't want my tax going towards this. So to me, it's actually a neoliberal solution. Anything that causes more division, causes us to go into pay for us, is a neoliberal solution. That's why someone like Nancy Pelosi supports state-by-state solutions, because she knows that it will never get done the proper way. We've seen that being true because what happened in Vermont. They got it passed, but they couldn't even get to the next level because the funding mechanism is so egregious, it's so hard to get through. And I know sometimes people say that, well, look, they did it in Canada, but they also did it during a different time. They did it in the 60s. They had the Canadian federal government was for getting this done, and they was ready and willing to do it. They just wanted a test case. In our case, we don't have a government that's ready and willing to do it. We have totally different times, and we have some states that it would never happen in the state level where it has to be done federally.
Absolutely. And I've spoken with actually just last week, Andy Kennedy, producer of the Macro and Cheese podcast, who lives in Ontario, came on and talked about some of those differences and made clear that this program, although in Canada it is administered at the provincial level, it has always been funded at the federal level from the jump. So, and the initial objection from provinces was out of concern that they were going to be financially strapped with this. So you're exactly right. The Canada example is not comparable to the United States. Well, Jabari, thank you so much for being here, and want to plug Jabari's Twitter handle there that's been up on the screen throughout this interview, Jab Morris. Make sure that you're following him. He does absolutely fantastic work for us, working on articles, he in Virginia, and he's also been a guest on some other political shows. He was with RJ at the Fred Hampton Leftist. So make sure you're not missing out on any of Jabari's content and great work. Thank you so much for taking the time today.
Oh, thank you, Luke, for the opportunity.
Absolutely. We'll talk again soon, I'm sure. Have a good one, Jabari.
You too.
All right, guys. So a couple of excellent interviews there. We have all sorts of fantastic content creators here at Real Progressives. Want to once again plug our website that we are getting these articles off of and other content, realprogressives.org. Make sure you're heading over there and contributing to our Patreon if you can, or reading our articles. And we have another interview coming up. I saved the big dog for last. We have our CEO and founder, Steve Grumbine, to talk in some more detail about the race to the bottom, and show you guys a portion of our website that we have dedicated to that particular topic. So that's coming up in a little bit, but I want to get through a couple more stories here. So Cori Bush, Congresswoman from Missouri, I believe it's Missouri. Did I just misstate that? Let me make sure I got that right. Missouri. Okay. She has come out and basically said she's going to put her foot down on an issue that I think is incredibly important. So here's Cori Bush retweeting a Politico article, which says police reform negotiators, are no longer considering changes to a controversial legal doctrine known as qualified immunity. For those that don't know, qualified immunity is provided to police. It basically means that they are immune from being sued in most cases for their violence towards civilians. It puts extreme barriers between people and lawsuits against cops and police departments. Cori Bush retweets this and says, "I can't make this any clearer. Ending qualified immunity must be in this bill, or there's no way I'll vote for it. And I'm not alone. We can't compromise on saving Black lives." Good for Cori Bush. You guys, I often find myself somewhat disappointed in the lefties in Congress, perhaps not utilizing their leverage and their power to a degree that I would like, and that I think many others on the left would like. Here's an instance where Cori Bush is saying, not going to vote for it unless you do X, Y, or Z. And there are many others. That's what we have been asking for, you guys. That's using your power in a way that actually might affect change. We'll see what comes of this. I'm under no illusion that the negotiators are going to simply fold to the will of the left. They are usually much more inclined to fold to the will of the corporatists and centrists. But to see members of Congress kind of putting their foot down on important issues like this and tweeting things as directly as this, that's a direct threat to the negotiators. Can't be misinterpreted, right? I love seeing this. And Cori Bush also had camped outside of Congress the evening that the eviction moratorium was set to expire. And that got what, again, did not address the root of the issue, but it at least got a portion of the moratorium extended. It got a step in the right direction. So this is an indication that the kind of direct action that we have been asking for, and the kind of utilizing leverage and power that we have been asking for, does work. It doesn't always work to the exact degree that we would like it to, but it works. And I'm thrilled to see Cori Bush and others starting to take it upon them to make statements like this. I hope that this one is held on to, because this is a very, there's no police reform without getting rid of qualified immunity. Really, we need more than reform. I've been saying for as long as I've been doing political commentary, I've been saying we need to defund and abolish police and start from scratch and come up with a department that is not rooted in slave catchers and that does not have inherently racist and classist mechanisms built into it. And this also very much means an extraordinary reform at the very least, if not a simple, dismantling of and rebuilding of the legal system and the so-called justice system, or the oppression system, as I like to call it. But if we're going to get anything substantive at all, it starts with ending qualified immunity for cops. Why are they immune from these lawsuits, you guys? They just are given a badge to go beat and kill people, and we say, yeah, no, because of your profession, you're allowed to do that, and we're not going to sue you. We're not going to allow people to sue you. And then they kill 1,300 people a fucking year. None of them get prosecuted, hardly ever. And then those that get prosecuted, hardly ever convicted. They have every protection at every step of this process. When you want to hold a cop accountable or a police department accountable, there's a hurdle in your way that you have to jump over. It's absurd. If we're serious about this change, if the Democrats are serious about this change, if Joe Biden is serious about this change, if Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer and the rest of leadership in Congress is serious about this change, then they will basically tell the negotiators, non-starter. If you won't get rid of qualified immunity, we're done here. Nothing to talk about. That's how this conversation should go. Because anything that doesn't include the end of qualified immunity is not a serious discussion from the jump. So good on Cori Bush for making this statement. I hope that she and others will follow through on this. And I hope that we see an end to qualified immunity, which desperately needs to go. I have another clip here for you guys. This is from More Perfect Union. Really want to encourage you to follow their work. They cover labor issues, strikes, and things of this nature. And this is about the Nabisco strike. So we'll watch this clip, come back, and discuss.
Woman that fall off of her chair recently and broke her ankle. We didn't have a nurse here. The supervisor wouldn't take her off of the line. We're treated like animals.
They made the most money they've ever made last year during the pandemic, but yet they don't want to give us what we're asking for.
It's like, go ahead, kick me again when I'm down. You just proved to me you're right. I'm just a number to you.
They have introduced what they call AWS, Alternative Work Schedule. So what they've done is actually changed the work shift from 8 hours to 12 hours. Now, after 8 hours, we get paid overtime for anything over 8. Now we're working 12 hours, and they're paying us a straight time.
The minimum lifting is 50 pounds here. We don't even have water fountains throughout the facility. This is a bakery. It can get to like 110 degrees in some areas. I mean, piping, smoking hot. And you're telling us that you want us to work 12 hours a day. How are you supposed to get your children from school working a 12-hour day? How are you supposed to make a family life work? How are you supposed to get dinner on the table? The math doesn't add up. By changing the length of time that you work, they're able to eliminate paying us fairly while actually working overtime. In 2016, they took our pension and gave us a 401k that's like paying pennies on the dollars. With the 401k, whatever I have when I retire, that's what I have. When I run out, I run out. The pension, as long as I'm living, I have something that can take care of my family. And that's why we worked for this place before they came. That's why one of the selling points for a person to come and make a career as a laborer here was the pension. To work for a company for 27 years, and they tell you, hey, we're gonna take your pension. For 27 years, I've planned to retire. I can't retire. And then the money that they're putting into the 401 at 59 and a half, I still may not be able to retire financially. I don't see retirement in my future. It's kind of bleak. Will I have enough money to live the rest of my life? No. But I've given the majority of my life to this company. $29 billion in profits, and you shut 2 plants. They're wondering who's next. We lost cheese nips last year. It's different products that we've had here, and we're losing it, and they're going to Mexico. You can't even talk about Mexico. You know, what I'm hearing is they make something like 96 cents an hour or 97 cents an hour. So it's hard for us to compete against that. Company would rather have profit than to have quality product.
and to send it to Mexico, they're getting the profit. That's it. It's money. Nothing else matters.
We can't even hardly find packages from our plant in the store. In 2020 and during the pandemic, we were considered essential personnel.
We've worked through COVID-19, day in, day out, 16 hours a day. We hung in there.
I worked every day during the pandemic. I did.
We are here to work. The company doesn't allow us to give the best of our abilities. They've gotten to the point where they don't care so much about us. We don't have a nurse on night shift.
The better quality of life your employee have, the better they feel about themselves, the better they feel about the work environment, and the better product they can put out.
We understand it's a business, but outside of the business, we are all people.
More brilliant work there from More Perfect Union. Again, I can't encourage you guys enough to follow their work. They're constantly covering strikes and things all over the country. And we've talked recently about strikes with Frito-Lay, strikes with coal workers, on and on. This is an incredibly important form of direct action. You guys, like I support protests, I support marches, I support all of these things. Strikes have the benefit of doing everything that a march or a protest does, plus economically hitting the very people that you're trying to influence. So if we really want to change things, the way to do that is to bring the system to a halt. This is the most effective form of protest, in my opinion, in most cases, is to strike, whether it's targeted to a specific company or industry, or whether it is a more general strike. And I am hopeful that we are getting to a point where general strikes are plausible. I mean, actually effective general strikes are plausible. We have to organize, and we have to set up the communications institutions for this stuff. We have to have mutual aid in place in order to execute this, because the capitalist class has so effectively put us in the corner of, you will not strike because then your quality of life depends on every single shift that you work if you're in the bottom portion of the economy. So we need to have answers for that in place so that we can execute an effective general strike that gets the attention of the powerful and the capitalist class. I support striking workers everywhere. I support labor organizing in virtually every sense. I support unions and anything that works to empower workers and work towards a more equitable economic system. And I also want to note, you guys, they said in that clip, they're not letting us be the best workers that we can be, or something to that. I'm paraphrasing, but something to that effect. It's interesting that the capitalists will actually choose oppression over efficacy in this kind of case. You do have better, if you pay your workers better and treat them better, you have more invested workers. You get to be more selective about your workers because more people are lining up for your jobs when they're available. In every way, you would benefit in the big picture from treating your workers better in most industries, but they take the short-term expediency route, the route that further oppresses a large chunk of their workers and keeps them in line. So there's an acknowledgement on behalf of these executives and shareholders and the capitalist class that they are better off oppressing us than they are enhancing their company's ability to make money in the long term. So like this is understood and acknowledged by the powerful, and we need to make it understood and acknowledged by the working class and the impoverished classes, those who have been victimized by that capitalist class. So huge support for any striking workers and labor organizers everywhere, union organizers everywhere, and huge support for More Perfect Union, who covers this stuff regularly and brings us these kinds of videos and other such content informing us about what is going on. When it comes to these kinds of strikes, we've tried to cover a lot of this stuff lately here at Real Progressives, covering the March for Medicare for All, covering the strikes in Lima, and more than that, and others. So I cannot encourage people enough to organize around this and to start working on that, thinking about how mutual aid and communication infrastructure can be set up for a general strike or a much more broad strike than we've been able to achieve thus far, because that is how you get the attention of the people whose attention you ultimately need if you want to make these kinds of changes. So we support, please don't buy Oreos, you guys. Don't buy anything from Nabisco. Don't cross that picket line. Don't buy Frito-Lay if you can avoid it. They're just chips. Don't buy them. Buy something else. Don't cross that line. And support these workers in any way that you possibly can. So I want to move on here to the story about Gavin Newsom being recalled. Gavin Newsom is the governor of California. There's a recall effort that is going to be finalized in mid-September. I believe September 12th. I might have that date a little bit off, but it's mid-September is when the actual vote occurs. Now, this is an interesting situation in that there are two things that people vote on. They vote, do they want to recall the governor? And then, if so, who do you want to replace him? Now, the replacement does not have to get a majority. It's just the person with the most votes, okay? So the Newsom campaign has found themselves in an interesting conundrum as to whether or not to tell people to vote for somebody in particular. They obviously say vote no on the recall, but they've thus far abstained from endorsing any of the other candidates or saying you should vote for so-and-so if you're going to recall him. So what is likely to happen here, and the polls are incredibly close, is either Newsom is not recalled by a slim margin, or he is recalled and then replaced by a Republican that may only get 20 or 30% of the vote. So I want to show you guys here a poll from, yes, I know, 538. It's I know. Take all of the, oh, excuse me, wrong. There we go. Take it with a grain of salt like you would with any poll, but that's actually going to be one of my key points here. So this is, you guys can see the chart there. Keep Gavin 48.8, to remove him 47.6. Now, if you look at the last handful of election cycles, you can basically add 3, 4, 5 points or so to the Republican and feel pretty safe in that analysis, just based on how the polling has gone in the last handful of election cycles. If we do that, then Gavin Newsom is going to be recalled. And it appears that in this particular race, the enthusiasm is on the side of Republicans, which means that it's an interesting question for Democrats in terms of whether they want a high turnout or not, because it's often the strategy of the left of the two candidates to encourage higher turnout and find success through that route. In this case, it may very well be that the grassroots position, if you will, the enthusiastic position in California, sides on the Republicans. So while these polls typically have Gavin staying in office by slim margins, it's also, the polls also reveal that Republicans are much more enthusiastic about and much more likely to participate in this recall election than Democrats are. Gavin Newsom obviously has, he's not exactly a progressive stalwart. He was caught at the French Laundry, which is a horrendously expensive restaurant. He threw a party right in the heat of COVID after he had put in these restrictions about going out, the shelter in place recommendations. He then went to the French Laundry to celebrate the 50th birthday of one of his good friends who's a lobbyist and who literally lobbies for massive corporations to the Democratic Party in California. He's close with leadership of the Democratic Party in California and uses his connection to them to lobby for massive corporations. So this was a bad look that Gavin engaged in, and that probably has quite a bit to do with this recall election. They seem to think that they're above all of the rules and laws, even the ones they implement themselves. Gavin Newsom also running on a green platform and then providing new drilling permits to all sorts of companies to drill and frack throughout California. Just a massive hypocrite and sort of a classic neoliberal Democrat who wants to portray himself as some sort of lefty or progressive. He is not. Now, that being said, I don't want him replaced by a Republican. I've seen the leading candidate make some pretty horrendous remarks opposing a minimum wage at all, things like this, very extreme far-right positions that this guy holds. Elder, I think his name is. I'm blanking on his first name. So this is a very unique scenario that this recall has gotten as far as it has, especially in a big state like California. And it will be interesting to see what happens in mid-September. I did want to cover this and explain some of the mechanics of it and how close it actually has become. California, obviously, as has been noted many times, would by itself be one of the biggest economies in the world. So the governor of California is a particularly powerful political seat. And you know, should not be taken lightly. But Gavin Newsom looks like he might be in trouble here, you guys. It's you know, I'm not predicting that he will be recalled, but it sure looks like it's going to be a lot closer than would be comfortable for Newsom and his campaign and his aides. So the next story here is a repeat of one that we have unfortunately had to talk about quite a bit. Israel is once again bombing the Gaza Strip. We've talked about how Netanyahu was ousted in favor of Naftali Bennett, who is perhaps even more extremist in his views than Netanyahu was. I showed you guys the interview maybe a month or two ago of Mehdi Hassan interviewing Bennett a few years back, where he basically said that he would prioritize his holy texts over the Supreme Court of his own country. And Mehdi Hassan kept asking him, is Israel a theocracy now? Are you saying that your religious texts supersede your Supreme Court? And Bennett basically answered yes. I mean, he didn't literally say that, but he basically said, Mehdi, if you want me to change my opinion, then go back and rewrite the Bible and the Torah. That is just absolutely terrifying. That's unhinged. It's beyond the pale. It's incredibly terrifying. It just really is a form of extremism that even Netanyahu knew to try to stay away from, and Netanyahu was no humanist himself. So last night, and really this is not the first time that this has occurred under Bennett or since the quote-unquote ceasefire was put in place, but last night I saw some pretty horrifying images of what was happening in Gaza, and we have an article here in Al Jazeera about this. Dozens hurt as Israel raids Gaza, fires at Palestinian protesters. 2 Palestinians, including a 13-year-old boy shot in the head by Israeli forces, are in critical condition. The Israeli military launched air raids on Gaza following clashes between its soldiers and Palestinian protesters during a demonstration to commemorate the burning of Jerusalem's Al-Aqsa Mosque 52 years ago. In a statement late on Saturday, the Israeli military said it struck 4 weapons manufacturing and storage sites in Gaza belonging to Hamas, the group that governs the besieged Palestinian enclave. 11 Palestinians were reportedly wounded. The raid came hours after Israeli soldiers opened fire on crowds of young Palestinians protesting at the fence separating Gaza and Israel. The Palestinian health industry said dozens of people were wounded, including a 13-year-old Palestinian boy who was shot in the head. 41 civilians were wounded with various injuries, the ministry said in a statement. The Israeli military called the protesters rioters and said some had tried to climb the border fence and hurled explosive devices at its soldiers. The military said it responded with riot dispersal means, including, when necessary, live fire. The Israel Border Police said a 21-year-old sniper in its undercover unit was critically wounded when he was shot by a Palestinian protester. His condition is critical, and there's a risk to his life, it said. Al Jazeera's, I'm not going to try with that name, you guys, I'm so sorry, reporting from Gaza said at least 10 of the Palestinians wounded were children and 2 were in critical condition. So Israel doing what it always does. It's the aggressor, it's the military grade force, and it plays victim. It shoots protesters, including a 13-year-old child, and then drops bombs all over the Gaza Strip. And then it plays victim. Unbelievable. This is a conflict that I just don't see resolving itself anytime soon unless the United States is willing to invoke its leverage. The United States could, in one single phone call, Joe Biden could end this. One phone call to Bennett. Hey, cut the shit or your aid is done. That's it. One sentence. It's not even a phone call. One sentence. And Bennett would be forced to cut the shit. One more settlement, your aid is done. That's all it would take. We are spending millions of dollars per day to protect the Israeli government. And as we know with MMT, it's about the resources. That's really what matters. But we send them weapons, we send them military assistance and service, all these kinds of things. So in many cases, when these bombs are being dropped on Gaza, whether it's a journalistic outlet or a road to a hospital or a COVID testing center or any other number of civilian outlets that were bombed by Israel in brazen war crimes, those bombs are often U.S. made. The planes dropping them are often U.S. made. And further, we geopolitically support this position, tepidly or not. Whether we out and out say we are good with the settlements, we clearly are. I'll quote Desmond Tutu. I'll paraphrase rather. I might not get this exactly right, but something to the effect of, in instances of oppression, to choose neutrality is to side with the oppressor. So the United States, by defending Israel geopolitically, by vetoing any condemnation of Israel from the UN or other international organizations, the United States does defend and support and prop up this ethnic cleansing campaign on behalf of the Israeli government and on behalf of Netanyahu and Bennett. One phone call, you guys. One phone call, and I'm in the country who could change this, and that's why I feel so passionately about this issue, and why I cover it as often as I do, because this is our fault. This is our fault. We also use our geopolitical might to scare other countries in the region into siding with Israel. In every possible way, we geopolitically assist and directly assist the genocidal actions of the Israeli forces, and it needs to stop now. And the way that the media reports on this is also quite egregious, and I'll tie it back to what we talked about earlier with Afghanistan. The hand-wringing about the admittedly horrific things that will happen to women in Afghanistan at the hands of the Taliban. The hand-wringing about that, compare that to how we deal with the treatment of Palestinian children. A 13-year-old was shot in the head. Do you see U.S. military hand-wringing about that? Do you see, U.S. media hand-wringing about that? Do you see the media condemning Joe Biden for his support of this? Of course you don't. Rank hypocrisy. And rank expediency to defend the state, the imperialism, etc. So we'll continue to keep up with that story. It's absolutely horrific what is happening in the West Bank and in Gaza, and the United States ought to put a halt to it, as only the United States or Israel could choose to do. So another interesting story here. Prince Andrew has been sued by Virginia Giuffre. Virginia Giuffre is a longtime accuser of Jeffrey Epstein. She was famously photographed with Prince Andrew, which kind of kicked off his being kicked out of the spotlight in the UK and being sort of banished from the royal family, at least in a public sense. So we have an article here. This is in The Guardian. Prince Andrew's reputation damaged forever by Giuffre claims, experts say. Lawyers say Duke of York has lost in court of public opinion and is unlikely to engage with civil case in U.S. The Duke of York faces an uphill battle to combat the impact of the sex offenses allegations made against him and has already lost in the court of public opinion, leaving his reputation highly tarnished and a return to royal duties impossible, experts have said. Following a damaging 2 weeks in which Andrew's accuser, Virginia Roberts Giuffre, lodged a civil lawsuit in New York alleging he had sex with her when she was 17, and a source claimed he was a person of interest in the Jeffrey Epstein investigation, the Duke is now caught between a rock and a hard place, said one expert. There has been silence from Andrew, who denies all allegations against him, and his legal team over the latest twists in the long-running case. A day after Giuffre lodged her claims, he headed for Balmoral and his ex-wife, Sarah, Duchess of York, in time for the opening of the grouse shooting season. Great, he's going to go hunt and run away from his problems. Buckingham Palace has consistently distanced itself from Andrew's travails. I'm finding all these weird words in this article, aren't I? Referring any inquiries to the Duke's personal legal and PR teams. However, that the Queen invited him to Balmoral and that she authorized him to lead public tributes over after the death of Prince Philip indicates her personal support, royal observers believe. So she is still holding him kind of close and not kicking him out from publicity in a way that many in the royal family appear to be doing. It's also worth noting that oh my goodness, what's her name? The Epstein's mistress. Oh my goodness. I can picture her face, totally blanking on her name. She's in prison right now. Anyway, she apparently has said that she will support Prince Andrew because of what he did for her social life. He basically rescued her reputation among the elites. And therefore will kind of go down with the ship on him. So it appears unlikely that we'll get any information from her as it pertains to Prince Andrew, but he clearly was involved here, it would appear, for the lawyers allegedly, in Epstein's sex scandals. And you know, the photographs and the lawsuits and the testimonials, all of this attributes to that. Many powerful and famous and incredibly wealthy people have been tied to Jeffrey Epstein, and that's why I cover this story. It's not just a one-off of one criminal who was engaging in heinous acts, right? There'd be hundreds of those if I just wanted to cover every single one-off. This fascinates me because powerful and incredibly wealthy people gravitated towards Epstein, and he was able to sort of use that as a shield from any condemnation or prosecution or persecution. And, you know, associating with Bill Gates and Alan Dershowitz and the Trumps and the Clintons and the royal family and all these people in Hollywood, and like it's ridiculous the amount of people who are associated in one way, shape, or form with Epstein. Obviously, the Bill Gates divorce now is apparently having quite a bit to do with Epstein, and Bill Gates was actually pressed by Anderson Cooper. That might be a slight exaggeration. Cooper asked him once about his relationship with Epstein, and Bill Gates out and out lied about it, you guys. He said, we went to dinner a couple of times, and then I realized I wanted nothing to do with him. Well, there's records demonstrating that Bill Gates flew on Jeffrey Epstein's private plane, that they were together significantly more than twice, and that they took trips together. So Bill Gates appears to be covering up the extent to which he was involved with Epstein. Whether or not that has anything to do with the sex scandal is really not the point. The point is that Epstein was so powerful that the likes of Bill Gates would gravitate towards him. There's not an investor or a bank or a hedge fund in the world that wouldn't take Bill Gates' money. Yet he gravitated to Epstein. Why do you think that is? Perhaps you believe it was the sex stuff. If you do, that might just be the answer, right? And I'm not saying it wasn't. But I'm fascinated by the incentive structure that's set up there. When someone is close to U.S. presidents, high-ranking members of Congress, and the royal family, they're going to have information that could be financially beneficial to just about anyone, especially someone with the kind of capital that Bill Gates has to invest. So I'm fascinated by the more almost insider trading element of this that I think undoubtedly exists. And how Epstein got to his fortune is also itself somewhat of a mystery. We know he ripped off some billionaires and things along the way, but how he accumulated that kind of wealth and power is somewhat of a mystery. Ghislaine Maxwell was her name. That just suddenly popped into my head. Ghislaine Maxwell. Anyway, that's what fascinates me about this, is his association to power and how people seem to gravitate towards him. And I want to make sure that no one is let off from these heinous crimes just because they're in a position of power or wealth. And that very much includes Prince Andrew. So we will be keeping up with this lawsuit and with the story more broadly. And I also just want to say to Virginia Giuffre, good for you. That takes a lot of courage to come forward, especially against someone as powerful as Prince Andrew is. So good on Virginia for bringing this forward, for continuing to press and say, no, I'm going to hold you responsible. I don't care how powerful you are. Good on you. That takes courage. If we had more people like that in our society, we would have a better society. So here's to hoping anybody who participated in Epstein's sex crimes or his trafficking or any financial crimes associated with him is held to some sort of account or another. Here's to hoping. I'm not naive enough to think it's going to be even close to the truth, but I hope to whatever extent it's possible that these people will be held to account. We had a horrible earthquake in Haiti. We've been keeping up a little bit on the political turmoil in Haiti with their president, Jovenel Moïse, being assassinated just months ago, and the resulting destabilization of the country, an already quite corrupt and impoverished country, largely due to U.S. intervention for decades. Moïse himself was somewhat of a puppet that we supported. He had overstayed his term and refused to hold elections, and the United States supported him in doing so. Now they're hit with an earthquake that has killed thousands of people. This is just absolutely devastating, you guys. They were hit with a major earthquake not all that long ago. I believe it was 2010, but I might have that year slightly off. And now they're hit with another one. This is in the Associated Press, just kind of talking about how desperate the situation is. Haitian quake victims rush aid sites, take food and supplies. Haitians left hungry and homeless by a devastating earthquake swarmed relief trucks and in some cases stole desperately needed goods Friday as leaders of the poor Caribbean nation struggled to coordinate aid and avoid a repeat of their chaotic response to a similar tragedy 11 years ago. The attacks on relief shipments illustrate the rising frustration of those left homeless after the August 14th magnitude 7.2 earthquake, which killed nearly 2,200 people, injured more than 12,000, and destroyed or damaged more than 100,000 homes. Quote, I have been here since yesterday, not able to do anything, said 23-year-old Safoni Numa, who waited outside an international aid distribution site in the small city of Camp Perrin, located in the hard-hit southwestern Lake Cayes region. Apologies if I'm butchering any of this. I have other people waiting for me to come back with something. Numa said her home was destroyed in the quake and that her sister broke her leg during the temblor. Quote, the food would help me a lot with the kids and my sister, she said. George Prosper, who was also in the large anxious crowd awaiting aid, quote, I am a victim. I was removed from under the debris. The 80-year-old Prosper said, I don't feel well standing up right now. I can barely hold myself up. This is just devastating stuff, you guys, that all these people are dying, that they're losing their homes in a country that was already impoverished, that was already overwhelmed with corruption and a destable political situation. Much of their Senate, they're supposed to have 30 members in their Senate. They only have 10 right now because Moïse refused to hold elections. The Chief Justice of their Supreme Court, who in one of their constitutions would have been set to take over for Moïse, died of COVID just a couple months ago. The whole country is in turmoil right now in ways that are hard to even describe. And it's absolutely horrific what's going on there. I did see that the United States was sending some aid, but we are, as always, behind and inadequate in the amounts. And, you know, it's to contribute to a country's destable situation and corruption and oppression, and then turn around and kind of let them suffer through a catastrophe that you contributed to their inability to respond to, is, to me, the height of arrogance and brutality and barbarism. And that is how the United States responds to these things. And there's also a point here about the media's hypocrisy. When Moïse was overstaying his term, did you see anybody hand-wringing about that in the same way that you see people hand-wring about Cuba, for example? Of course not. Or Afghanistan, for example? Of course not. Do you see the press going on and on about how we have contributed to a tragedy that killed over 2,000 people and left 100,000 homes destroyed? Of course you don't. Do you see the media talking about how horrible the situation is for civilians in Haiti right now? Desperate enough to have to steal aid in order to eat? Do you see any hand-wringing about that? No, you don't, because they know the United States is fucking responsible for part of it. So no coverage there. We're let off the hook. We're just going to hand-wring about women in Afghanistan and Cuba. We're not going to talk about the Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar, right? We're not going to talk about the devastation that we're contributing to in Yemen. We're not going to talk about what's just happened to Palestinians in Gaza or in the West Bank. No, we're going to ignore those while we hand-wring about Afghanistan and Cuba. So this is another example of the press's rank hypocrisy. And what's happening in Haiti is absolutely devastating. If you can contribute to aid efforts in Haiti, I encourage you to. And unfortunately, there are just too many places in the world who need aid right now. Haiti being one of them. Absolutely devastating stuff that's going on there in Haiti. So wishing all the best to the Haitian people, and I hope that they can find a more stable political situation in addition to, getting the aid that they need and getting their homes rebuilt as quickly as possible. Though, again, I'm not naive enough to think that this will come true. So at this point, you guys, I want to show you the clip I recorded a day or two ago with Steve Grumbine. Steve is our founder and CEO. Steve also hosts the Macro and Cheese podcast and co-hosts the New Untouchables. Make sure you're not missing the New Untouchables dropping Sunday evenings. So there will be a new episode tonight on Real Progress in Action. It covers banking corruption and the way that the banking and financial institutions harm everyday people. It's an absolutely fantastic series. Really want to encourage everybody to check it out. Patrick Lavelle and Eric Vaughn, along with Steve, are kind of the anchor of that series. Anyway, this is Steve talking about the race to the bottom, and we show you a new portion of our website, progressives.org, where you can find information about this particular topic. So enjoy this discussion with Steve. Very happy to have with me today our founder and CEO, Steve Grumbine of Real Progressives. Steve is host of the Macro and Cheese podcast, a podcast on economic and political issues from an MMT lens. Make sure that you're not missing that podcast if you don't check it out already. Steve, thank you so much for taking the time to be here.
Absolutely, man. Thanks for having me on, buddy.
So we wanted to talk a little bit about a popular news story right now, and in many ways there are newsworthy elements of this story about what's going on in Afghanistan. There's this particular narrative out there that the United States has spent $300 million per day on this war, and that is driving the nation broke, and this kind of disingenuous narrative. Can you explain a little bit what that actually means and why spending that money as we did is actually problematic in a real resource sense, as opposed to how that narrative has played out in the mainstream press?
Well, sure. So, Luke, actually, the way our country operates, unfortunately, is that we've become enamored, if you will, of military spending over the last 50, 60, 70 years, because it's a way of getting money into the economy without having to explain socialism or any other things that get them bogged down ideologically. And so, support the troops, be patriotic, these colors don't run, all these tropes, salute the flag. It all plays into spending on the military. And when it comes to making a booming economy, you need the federal government to constantly be spending into the economy, especially an economy like ours, which is largely a net importer. I mean, I believe our net importing status is somewhere in the neighborhood of $500 billion per year in terms of the difference between what we bring in and what we send out. So minimally, the federal government would look to put at least that back into the thing to avoid, a money famine, as my friend Steve Larchuk says. So I think it's important to kind of understand, first of all, that the reason why we spend so much on the military isn't just to be the world police. It is largely the only way that people bipartisanly are willing to spend money into the system. And that money makes it first to Halliburton, it makes it first to Lockheed Martin, it makes it to Boeing, it makes it to all these different groups out there. And then it is spent on troops, it's spent on airplanes, it's spent on a host of different things. And each of those airplanes are built with piece parts from around the country. Each of those buttons on that soldier's uniform are built in different parts of the country. And so ultimately, the way we spend on the military is a way of getting money into the economy to get it into the system and so forth. And so what I think you see here is at $300 million a day to equip the army to stay out there in Iraq or in Afghanistan or whatever, this this is serving multiple geopolitical concerns, but it is also the main spigot into the economy to pour money without rebuttal. You know, I mean, you saw Trump was able to go world famous with making, I think it was 750 billion on the military budget, and Joe Biden said, "Hold my beer," and it made it even bigger. And that's because they understand that nobody's going to really push back on spending on the military. And so usually we focus on empire, we focus on, you know, wars across the globe. But if you look, many of the planes and different things that we build, they never make it to theater. They're sitting there unused because we're not at war. We're not doing these things. And so again, you spend money on these things we don't necessarily need, but that money becomes someone else's income, and then it becomes their spending and so forth. And that's how the whole trickle down argument operates. So in terms of, you know, the actions in Afghanistan, I think it's important to note that as we pull out of Afghanistan, et cetera, that 300 million, you know, is monies that we're not going to be spending anymore in that realm, even though we asked for even more in the military budget. So something's going on there, right? Something is not quite making sense unless you realize that ultimately this is really about how do they get money into the economy without pushback. So I don't know
And
if
of
I
course,
answered your question.
You absolutely did. And unfortunately, in our corrupt society, a lot of that money ends up in the shareholders and investors of Lockheed Martin and Boeing and Raytheon and General Dynamics and Northrop Grumman and all these other military contractors. But that's a political problem, not so much an economic one, which is what you're speaking about. And I would actually note even Wolf Blitzer, who I think is absolutely awful, when someone pushed back on the Forever Wars. I'll never forget this clip. Wolf looks right into the camera and says, "What about the jobs? Like we need to bomb black and brown people around the world because of jobs, right?" Well, we happen to have an answer for that, and perhaps you can explain briefly what our response to that line of narrative would be.
Sure. I mean, you know, even if we maintained a standing army, even if we like really heavily invested in the military, there's nothing that prevents the military, especially those soldiers, from doing things domestically, not war, but doing actual work, doing actual efforts, if you will, to rebuilding infrastructure, Army Corps of Engineers, on and on and on. There's so much that we could do with that disciplined crew as opposed to killing people. It's not funny. But what if we said maybe the military isn't the right way of getting employment? Maybe that's not the best use of those tools. Well, you look at the infrastructure in this country, it's falling apart. So by having a robust infrastructure bill, we could hire lots and lots and lots of blue collar workers to fill the void that's made by pulling out of Iraq. But let's just say that you're looking at it and you say, well, not everybody's going to get filled by that. And you're right. So what about a federal job guarantee? And that federal job guarantee is a federally funded, locally administered, voluntary right to a job. And it's socially productive work as opposed to working for the man. It's not intended to compete with capital. It's not intended to compete with, private sector markets. It's intended to be social spending for the social good, for the public purpose in the local community. And so imagine, people coming out of high school, maybe leaving college, trying to find a job while they're in college, whatever, a federal job guarantee would pay them a living wage, give them benefits, et cetera. So those low-end wage earners wouldn't have to go into the military. There would be an opportunity here through the job guarantee. So there's a lot of ways of mitigating that lack of spending, but I want to be crystal clear. We don't need to cut spending. The problem is that because we couldn't get social programs paid for, they in turn spent even more money on the military to keep our economy from falling apart. It had nothing to do, shouldn't say nothing to do, but largely it was about getting money into the economy. And they used this as a backdoor way. But there was an incredibly important documentary that I wanted to touch on going back to the manufacturing of planes and things like that. John McCain, ironically, was in this, and it was called Why We Fight. And what you found was this systematic way of building an airplane. They purposely build the knobs in Massachusetts and the seat lever in Wisconsin and the seat cushion in Florida and the the digital displays in Washington State, and
you keep
each
everyone
one of
on
these
board that
things,
way, right?
keep everyone on board. Everyone's getting a taste of the military pie. And you know what? Those states are desperate for that funding, because without it, they're really in trouble, because they don't have enough money, because the federal government doesn't spend on social spending. It really doesn't. The federal government largely tries to stay deficit neutral, which means it drives up the taxes to offset any spending, which is a zero-sum gain. And it's like a household budget narrative.
Right.
When in reality, I mean, why the heck wouldn't they just go ahead and spend it and then tax away whatever they need to tax away to stave off, really very limited inflation? And
yeah,
these are questions that I think we need to understand, or situations we need to understand, because people always ask why is this happening? And you can tell that if they went ahead and said, yes, kill the F-35 fighter plane, kill that project dead. Well, all those piece parts that have been farmed out across the country and in some cases around the world, those people are going to be like, hey, where's my money? Where's my cash cow? That cash cow is how money gets into that local grocer, sadly. That's their methodology for it. So you pull the plug on building the F-35, you pull the plug on these different things. And unless you're offsetting that by new spending, and cutting spending here does not constitute having money left over. When you stop spending here, it requires a new bill for something else to have new spending. Cutting spending, raising taxes does nothing to actually putting money into the economy. I think it's really, really important. I think most people miss this.
It's quite a cynical gun that they kind of have held to the head of voters, that hey, if you oppose this strongly enough, then you're basically going to cripple your own community. And that's to tell a very brief personal story. I'm back in school now, but I was expelled from high school the day after I was expelled from for weed. Nothing. It was for weed. But anyhow, the point is, the next day, I kid you not, the very next day, I got an email. I was 17 years old. I got an email from an Army recruiter.
Oh my God.
And I gave that recruiter a piece of my mind. Like, how dare you prey on me and other, economically, people in tough economic situations who've just lost their opportunity at an education. So to your point, the military being the employer of last resort and the only option for people who might have no other way to fund their education, that would go away if we had a federal job guarantee, and you would not be forced into this particular scenario. You tweeted earlier, kind of talking broadly about something you just mentioned. And before we get into the race to the bottom, I was just hoping you could comment on this. You talked about decoupling these two ideas, decoupling the taxation policy from the spending policy. Can you just elaborate a little bit on what MMT teaches us about this and why these should be separate discussions as opposed to connected?
Sure. Yeah. The purpose for taxation is not to fund programs at the federal level. The purpose of this is to drive currency, to put a necessary obligation to maintain the strength and viability of the dollar. It's not based on petrodollar. It's not based on, military Keynesianism or anything like that. It's based on the ability to produce real goods and services. And it's based on the idea that our tax is payable only in the said currency. So if you think about what the purpose of taxes are, they're to basically control certain types of behaviors, to regulate them out of existence, Pigovian type taxes. It's also to kind of level set the pricing structure as a numeraire. And if you don't know what a numeraire is, it's kind of like a reference point. It doesn't mean that this spending or whatever is actually paying for this. It's like kind of like a check mark on a spreadsheet. Yeah. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
It's denominated in that. It's kind of like this is the unit of account, but it's not it's not used to spend. So they might do this on a spreadsheet, like what you see with Social Security, when you get that document back that says I paid 32,000 into Social Security over my lifetime, or 100,000 or whatever, and you're like, hey, I paid into Social Security. Well, no, it really is just, you got a statement of how much you paid, and that's it. It tells you how much you made annually, and it tells you how much you paid into the system. It doesn't actually fund Social Security. So if you think about it like that, decoupling taxation from spending makes all the sense in the world. I mean, we're no longer tied to credit markets. We're no longer tied to any of that. So the tax can be useful in solving for inequality. It can be useful to drive certain behaviors and to maybe stop certain behaviors, like speculative behavior on the Wall Street markets. It might be used to stop smoking. Let's say that it's starting to really cause our healthcare system to collapse even worse than it is now. And so they want to go ahead and tax cigarettes higher. It's not necessary to raise money per se, because anything that you tax to raise money for, you got to keep that in place. Otherwise, your funding source dries up. So if you're raising taxes on cigarettes, naturally, that means you want cigarettes to stay around so you can pay for them, right? Wrong. They're doing it to get rid of cigarettes so that you don't smoke. So that's the Pigovian side of it. None of this is a funding operation for any programs. So the real question is, what do we care about? What do we want to fund? If we can fund it, if we can create it, and we can buy it with US dollars, it's affordable. We can do it, period. Because we create dollars out of thin air when we spend, and we delete them when we tax. So if you're only going to delete the tax, and the purpose of the tax is to stave off inflation or to drive behaviors, well, then make yourself a separate tax policy that has nothing to do with the spending policy, and stop saying you're funding it with taxes, because you're not funding with taxes. Start talking about real. Say we foresee that, you know, we're going to need to have certain automatic stabilizing taxes kicked in should certain events happen. Certain events. So we bake them in with automatic stabilizers. We have automatic stabilizers for spending. There's no reason we can't have automatic stabilizers for taxation as well. If we hit certain, you know, things in the economy, inflation isn't just rising slightly, it's like spiraling up, escalating constantly month after month after month. You know, one month it's 4%, next month 5%, next month 6%, 7, 8, 9. That right there is escalating you know, inflation. But average inflation, you know, 2-3%, that's normal, and we need that, because otherwise people that are in debt would never be able to get out of debt ever. They would always be in chronic debt. So, and it would also put the havers, the people that have money, always in the catbird seat, whereas the people that don't have would always be in a horrible situation. So decoupling taxation, creating a tax plan that works based on the purpose it's derived for, and having spending specific to working on whatever subject you're trying to achieve, you can have an honest debate about the spending that way. You know that it's not going to bankrupt us. You know that it's not about taxes. So let's talk about what our nation's priorities are. You know, is it a moral hazard? Whatever, you know, but
I like the way I've heard it put is that budgets are priorities. You just have to look at it that way. That when Congress puts a budget out there, it's saying what is important, how it's prioritizing things, etc. And I would also add to what you're saying. I think taxes can be used to create a more equitable society. When we have a wealth gap like this, I think you could put in some sort of, not in the political environment we currently have, we're talking theoretically, but you could put in some sort of automatic tax. When the wealth gap hits X, we implement X tax on billionaires, or whatever it might be. So I completely and totally agree with that. So we wanted to talk a little bit about the race to the bottom today. I have a map here on realprogressives.org. If you haven't checked out our website, make sure to do so. We have all sorts of articles and fantastic content there for you. And our Patreon is there too if you'd like to support our organization. One new portion of our website is the race to the bottom, and this map is shown there. Steve, I'm hoping you can just kind of briefly explain what the race to the bottom is, and then we can go into some of the specifics of this map and what the numbers mean.
Sure. Yeah. So the race to the bottom is an unfortunate thing that happens in a country set up the way ours is. States are all competing with one another for business. They're competing for people to live there. They're competing for jobs. They're competing for a host of things. And what ends up happening is that, businesses are always looking for the most sweetheart deal they can get tax wise to set up their headquarters or move their, operations plant or whatever into the, into another state, and they use this as kind of like bribery to get the other state to drop the bottom out of their tax base for them to give them sweetheart deals and perks and so forth. And they always promise, hey, we'll bring in 100,000 jobs to the state, or we'll bring in 50,000, or we'll bring in 10,000, or whatever. And so the state says, oh, an untold wealth is going to come in because your business is going to come here, or they'll give us this tax base and so forth. Well, when Texas says, hey, we don't have any sales tax, or we don't have any income tax, or we don't have, whatever, or hey, we're going to do it this way, and you guys we'll give you money to come down here to Texas, and people like Rick Perry and and many Texas governors have often bragged about their strategy of luring people down there to Texas. Well, you look and you can see how that migration occurs, how the Flint, Michigans of the world become Flint, Michigan when the industry leaves, when Detroit starts moving its auto processing down to Mexico or some other state. You look at Sam Brownback in Kansas, and you realize that they dropped the bottom of the tax rate for businesses with the hope that they would lure them in there. And lo and behold, they were so cash strapped that schools couldn't even open. They were using books that were like 10 years old, falling apart. I mean, it was awful. So the race to the bottom is really about the states devouring each other in pursuit of business and lowering the taxes, and then invariably the fracking companies come in and they offer sweetheart deals for fracking, and the states starve for cash, so they offer it to them with the idea of taxing fracking fracking monies to fund state programs. So now you're funding yourself to the destruction of the environment,
right?
And so there's so much more to this, but ultimately, because the federal government is the currency issuer and states are currency users, they're highly dependent on taxes, they're highly dependent on investments, and they're highly dependent on the federal government springing funding on them in different ways. And when you take away the tax base and business leaves, and now you take away the commerce and the jobs are gone, your tax base, zip code by zip code, which pays the schools, dries up and they fall apart. And so what we talk about the race to the bottom is this competition that drives things down until the people are left without a boat to get out. They have no way of getting out, and they're trapped. And then those businesses leave. And that's the typical Rust Belt story that you see throughout the United States. Buffalo, former Pittsburgh, many places. I mean, you see counties, states, municipalities going broke. They have unfunded mandates. They have pension plans that are blowing up, that are like unfunded or underfunded. A whole bunch of things are put on the states. And so what do the states do? They cut spending, because that's their only recourse. They either raise taxes, which then prompts the others to leave, or they cut spending. And this is the catch-22 the states find themselves in. So this map here, it's not finished. This is nowhere near done. But the idea is to look at what they call the CAFR reports, or the Comprehensive Annual Financial Reports. And these are a fiscal position of every state in the country. And they have to report these to Congress. And so you can find the CAFR reports out there, and you can find them by your state. And so what we're doing with this is we're trying to demonstrate not only the fiscal position of each state, and show how very little wiggle room each of them have, and show that some of the states like California and others are significantly in better shape. So once you learn how that race to the bottom works, then you start being able to determine a little bit better how states are, because they can't create currency. So they either got to lure business in to get that tax revenue back up, or they end up cutting. And that's what the race to the bottom is really all about.
And I would add to that, you've described what the dynamics are. Imagine how severely vulnerable and susceptible this dynamic leaves these programs to a recession or to an economic crash, right? Then the state is in a place where its ability, which is already restricted to fund these programs, is even more severely restricted. There are a whole bunch of potentials for problems when you fund your programs through this through a state-based plan. So I'm going to start with your state here, Steve. You guys can see up on the screen here. I'm sorry, that's Ohio. Here's Pennsylvania. Oh, it's there. New Jersey, Pennsylvania. Homeless population of 13,199. Your pensions are funded 54.8%, and your rainy day fund is 3.6 days. Can you just kind of briefly explain what those numbers mean and what they indicate for Pennsylvania?
Yeah, so the government can run for 3.6 days without, any income coming in. It's got enough to last for 3.6 days. The other issue is the pensions. They're 54% funded. In other words, people who have believed their entire lives that their pension would be there may not be there. And they're underfunded. They should be picked up by the federal government immediately across the nation, but they're not. And so my state is always in precarity. I mean, if you look in Pennsylvania, we have what is called the Marcellus Shale. And the Marcellus Shale is the group that does fracking, and they do road improvements and everything else. And there even some talk about funding schools with the revenues from the fracking dollars. So this is the way they're trying to make up for that delta. The other alternative is, because we are largely a purple state, so a lot of Republicans here, you're going to see a lot of public-private partnerships, a la neoliberal framing.
Right.
You're also going to see a lot of push to reduce spending, cut spending, make people get back to work, forget the pandemic, rush back to the office, rush back to school. And that whole thinking comes from the race to the bottom, because they want to get commerce back going. And ultimately, that's what those numbers mean.
Well, and let's take a look then at a state that is outwardly in better shape, which is my state, Washington. We have a higher homeless population, though, 21,577 homeless in Washington state, 94% roughly pensions funded, and a rainy day fund of 25.5 days. I just want to note here that some of the dynamics you just talked about, where fracking is the industry of fracking would be empowered sort of politically by funding these programs. Washington state you may think of us as a progressive state, and relatively, I suppose we are, but Boeing is a horrible polluter. They've participated in the military industrial complex, which we started this conversation off talking about. Do you want to empower them in this way? Starbucks utilizes slave labor overseas for beans. Do you want to empower that company in this way? Microsoft, Amazon, we talk all the time about how brutal Amazon is to their workers. Do you want to empower this company in these ways? So I was hoping you could comment on, even in the states where some of these state programs may appear more viable, what are some of the political downsides to engaging in state-based programs in a state, even where it appears outwardly that state can afford, quote unquote, to do that, or can more easily implement that program?
Well, whatever you tax, you legitimize. Okay. And so if you're expecting to tax billionaires, you're legitimizing billionaires, because that means you need those billionaires to fund your programs. Okay. So you're naturally not going to attack wealth, because you need their wealth to be able to fund the programs. Your businesses that are bad actors, that are like those folks fueling the military industrial complex. Your state is highly dependent on the revenues coming from Boeing, from Starbucks and their slave labor with the beans, and all the other scenarios you painted. The minute you tax them, you legitimize that. And that means that you have to depend on them to keep your revenues up. So what are you going to do if you depend on them for your revenues? Once you start raising taxes on them, okay, they have options, because there's Texas down there going, come on down to Texas. We got a home for you there, brother. And Texas, they say, you see that meme where you got the hot girl walking like this, and the guy sitting there turning back like
turning
this,
around.
and
Yeah. He's rubbernecking.
Right. That's the Texas scenario, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you got Boeing going, oh, check out Texas. And then you've got Seattle and all of them going, how dare you look at Texas, right? That's
Boeing
kind of the
already
deal.
moved one of their major plants to North Carolina. They already did it just a few years ago.
Exactly. And this will continue to happen as we've got a huge amount of history that you don't even need to speculate from. You can just crack a book, click a link, and not clickbait. Click a link about the race to the bottom. Find out, there's a lot of fraud that goes on also. There's a lot of payola. There's a lot of things that make each state really, really suspect when you give them specific cash without encumbering it from the federal government. And encumbering, what I mean by encumbering is you're putting stipulations on that money. It must do X, it must do Y, it must do Z. And like when you're in the federal government, they have certain rules on procurement. You have to do what they call the FAR, the Federal Acquisition requirements or whatever. And basically it says you got to have at least 3 bidders to pick a thing. You can't just go to someone as a sole source and just pick them, right? You have to actually bid the stuff out. And when you think of it like that, I think it's kind of important to think about what it's like at the state level, right? I mean, the state is got similar type requirements on it as well. And everything about the state is completely dependent, sadly, on that federal spending. So, the race to the bottom, this whole dynamic here, especially in somewhere like Washington State that looks really good, you say, well, you progressives out there, you are legitimizing Boeing. You're legitimizing Amazon. You're legitimizing Microsoft or whatever. Everything that you tax, you legitimize. Okay. And now you're dependent on. So, obviously our goal here is to get the federal government to get in the business of spending directly. And when they spend on the states, to encumber that. Block grants to the states are fine, but how much of that money actually makes it to the people? And so it's important to stipulate that in your bill. It's important to put some parameters around that. This money is intended for these 5 things: to rebuild schools, to rebuild roads, to fix all your bridges, to whatever.
Right.
And if they don't do that, then there should be some serious penalties. And so what ends up happening is that because the federal government is not doing that, a lot of these well-meaning groups are trying to find a way to fund their programs and fund their ideas by taxing the rich. And again, it sounds good, eat the rich, until the rich pick up and leave and go to Texas. So I think this is just one of those natural things you talk about in Marxist theory. You talk about capital flight. Well, you also have suburban flight. You also have white flight from the cities where they leave. And all of a sudden they leave those cities without a tax base. Right. And this is not me saying this like, oh, what a bad guy I am. This is me saying this is how it is.
Yeah.
That's how it is. It's empirical.
Take it or leave
how
it.
It is.
Yeah.
I'm not, don't hate the player, hate the game. This is the game. So
no, we are not sitting here endorsing this horrendous system at all. In fact, we're sitting here criticizing it and saying you should fund this stuff at the federal level where you can afford to do so.
Yes.
The last thing about this, I really wanted to get your thoughts on, Steve. There seems to be a whole nother angle to this, and I'll take it really big picture and use a really extreme example, which is the Civil War. We fought that war over a state's right to infringe on the rights of the Black community. At some point, every person agrees that we should not let states infringe on people's rights to that degree. States should not have the power to do that. When it comes to something, to use a smaller picture example like Obamacare, where states were left in charge of to what extent are they going to fund certain aspects of this program, you end up in a position where 20-some, 30-some states grossly neglect their constituents, really all of them, but you get the point that I'm saying in relative to other states. You get a number of states which choose to neglect their citizens. So when you leave this much power in charge of the states, how do you end up sort of making up for that if you're not going to engage in federal spending in terms of how those states are going to treat the poor and impoverished and marginalized communities in their among their residents.
Well, I think you saw the 14th Amendment used to justify the ACA individual mandate, and you saw it used with the Commerce Clause. But you also realize that part of this is about, in making all things equal protection under the law kind of thing. And so with that in mind, by not focusing on how they make things unequal, I should say, you miss the big picture. So I think part of this is federalizing everything has created a very, very bad scenario for the most vulnerable. I think that ultimately the federal government has to step in. But if it won't step in financial or fiscally with money, it should at least step in by eliminating the unfunded mandates and things like that they impose upon states, that states then in turn have to make up that money for somehow to pay for that federal law that was never funded at the federal level. And I think that some of this could be mitigated by eliminating all unfunded mandates. But there is no way of really controlling the state unless when you give them that money, you encumber it and you say it must do this, that, and the other. And you saw the states reject Medicaid expansion. You saw the states reject a bunch of opportunities, like even prolonging, giving unemployment benefits to people, federal monies for that. They reject it. Why? Because they want to get people back to work. Why? Because their donors are begging them to get them back to work. And so ultimately, again, there's no real way of controlling that short of encumbering those dollars or regulation. And, our government doesn't appear to be overly interested in regulation, not good regulation. And they certainly are not interested in trying to force the states to do things, because we still have no right to an education in this country.
Yeah.
We still don't have it. It's all still state-based and it's all paid for by the local zip code.
Yeah.
That should easily be taken over by the federal government, but such a horrible fight would break out. This has been before the, Supreme Court board, Brown versus the Board of Education, you name it. And ultimately it turns out there is no federal right to education, and therefore the states own that, the payoff for education. And that's why you see so much inequality. That's why you see rich neighborhoods having great schools, poor neighborhoods belly up. And, ultimately, I think that it really comes down to understanding how federal finance mixes with state finance and being able to craft policy that will take in the worst parts of state-based behavior and mitigate the race to the bottom by staving off the need to tax certain groups to you tax them because they're too damn rich, but tax them at the federal level, because if you tax them at the state level, they'll just pick up and move somewhere else. And they do it all the time.
Well, I think this is a really important topic for us to keep discussing and driving home and trying to educate people on. And lastly, Steve, can you just talk about the Macro and Cheese podcast, what you do with that podcast, where and when people can find it, and what you have coming up and things like that?
Yeah, so I'm actually a host of two important podcasts. One is Macro and Cheese, and that's on Saturday mornings at 8 a.m. It's released Eastern time. And you can find it on our website, www. You go to realprogressives.org and go to our media drop down, and Macro and Cheese is under that. But I also do co-host another podcast that we release on Sunday nights called New Untouchables, and it's very important. It shows that elite control, fraud, corruption, you name it, is very much driving our financial system in this country, including propping up property values because states are tax strapped. And so you got these inflated property values for taxes, you name it. And so the New Untouchables really draws that stuff out, and it shows how you and I and everybody else are not safe if we own a home. It shows that the powers that be are willing to turn a blind eye while elite control fraud happens in these companies and Wall Street, and the revolving door between Wall Street and our government continues. and the laws and stuff are written by Wall Street. And so when you look at the stealing of homes and the rocket docket and the robo signings and all the rest that go into foreclosures and so forth, the New Untouchables is where you're going to find all that information. So Sunday nights, 8 p.m. Eastern time is the New Untouchables. Macro and Cheese is a podcast released Saturday mornings, 8 a.m. And it's all about modern monetary theory and subject matters that tie closely to it, from union organizing to understanding the Green New Deal and a great many other things that should be very important to all progressives.
Fantastic work. I want to encourage everybody to check it out if you're not already watching these shows. And this is going to drop Sunday, so make sure that the New Untouchables is dropping tonight if you're watching this live. Make sure that you don't miss that on
Sunday. Oh yeah, duh.
Yeah. This is a pre-recording. Yeah. So make sure to catch that tonight. And also I've had it up on the screen here next to Steve's name. He put it there. But if you don't follow Steve on Twitter, it's at SD Grumbine. Make sure that you're following him for fantastic, tweets as well as sharing of content and things like this. So Steve, thank you so much for taking the time, and look forward to doing this again.
Thanks, buddy. Appreciate it, man.
Always happy to talk to Steve. He is always quite insightful. This is a critical conversation, you guys, for us to be having right now. Understanding the macroeconomics behind these programs, understanding the funding mechanisms, understanding how to best implement these programs, and in what ways to avoid implementing them so as not to do harm to our own movement. This is all really, really critical stuff. Just want to, I know we were talking about it on that interview, but just want to really encourage you, if you aren't catching the Macro and Cheese podcast and the New Untouchables tonight on Real Progress in Action YouTube, and you can catch Macro and Cheese Saturday mornings, 8 Eastern. And, just make sure that you're understanding the economics behind these programs. I know you guys, I'm a nerd. I'm an economics nerd. For me, this stuff is fascinating. And I'm sure for some portion of my audience, that is also the case. I understand that for a lot of people, macroeconomics is somewhat dry and somewhat boring. Please bore yourself for at least enough time to understand at a rudimentary level how these programs are funded, because it will enhance your understanding of the programs and the policies that you most strongly endorse and fight for. Things like healthcare, things like a federal jobs guarantee, things like a Green New Deal, things like housing reform, things like education reform, etc. These all have fiscal implications, and understanding the funding mechanism and the macroeconomics behind it is critical. I really want to encourage everybody to follow Steve's work at SD Grumbine. Follow the podcasts that were mentioned, Macro and Cheese and the New Untouchables. And we will be continuing to discuss this issue, this race to the bottom issue, and trying to bring some education to the masses, which unfortunately have a pretty drastic misunderstanding of how the monetary system and how fiat currencies operate. I'm so sorry for going over again, you guys. I try to keep these podcasts to 2 or 2.5 hours. Doing a few interviews ends up pushing it over, and I do have a few more stories that I would like to get through today. This is an article here in the Associated Press. It's about how tech is being misused and applied in ways that end up wrongfully arresting people, and this is a major discussion that needs to be happening, you guys. Like that needs to be happening. We need to discuss to what extent it's acceptable to utilize tech in policing. We need to have these conversations in a serious manner. Again, this is in the Associated Press. How AI-powered tech landed man in jail with scant evidence. This in Chicago. Michael Williams' wife pleaded with him to remember their fishing trips with the grandchildren, how he used to braid her hair, anything to jar him back to his world outside the concrete walls of Cook County Jail. His 3 daily calls to her had become a lifeline, but when they dwindled to 2, then 1, then only a few a week, the 65-year-old Williams felt he couldn't go on. He made plans to take his life with a stash of pills he had stockpiled in his dormitory. Williams was jailed last August, accused of killing a young man from the neighborhood who asked him for a ride during a night of unrest over police brutality in May. But the key evidence against Williams didn't come from an eyewitness or an informant. It came from a clip of noiseless security video showing a car driving through an intersection and a loud bang picked up by a network of surveillance microphones. Prosecutors said technology powered by a secret algorithm that analyzed noises detected by the sensors indicated Williams shot and killed the man. I kept trying to figure out How can they get away with using the technology like that against me, said Williams, speaking publicly for the first time about his ordeal. That's not fair. Williams sat behind bars for nearly a year before a judge dismissed the case against him last month at the request of prosecutors who said they had insufficient evidence. Williams' experience highlights the real-world impact of society's growing reliance on algorithms to help make consequential decisions about many aspects of public life. Nowhere is this more apparent than in law enforcement, which has turned to technology companies like gunshot detection firm ShotSpotter to battle crime. ShotSpotter evidence has increasingly been admitted in court cases around the country, now totaling some 200. ShotSpotter's website says it's a leader in precision policing technology solutions that helps stop gun violence by using sensors, algorithms, and artificial intelligence to classify 14 million sounds in its proprietary database as gunshots or something else. But an Associated Press investigation based on a review of thousands of internal documents, emails, presentations, and confidential contracts, along with interviews with dozens of public defenders in communities where ShotSpotter has been deployed, has identified a number of serious flaws in using ShotSpotter as evidentiary support for prosecutors. This is just a huge problem, you guys, and it's more broad than just this one piece of technology. AI is going to be utilized as it continues to develop further for the interests of those currently benefiting from the status quo. In other words, the interests of the wealthy class, the interest of the politicians, the interests of the powerful class, etc. That's anyone who follows anything about policing knows you do not want to give them the ability to use an algorithm by their own terms, on their own terms. And, you know, that even prosecutors finally came out after almost a year and said, yeah, we need to drop this, is indicative of how absurd these cases can get. I would like to see us have a serious and robust conversation about the extent to which technology should be used in law enforcement and in prosecutions. This kind of technology has every potential to wrongfully arrest and wrongfully convict people, as Mr. Williams was subjected to. And I think this is an element of the police brutality discussion that we are not having quite enough. Police brutality, a constant. We kill 2 or 3 people per day in this country. If you look at the yearly average of well over 1,000, it's like 12 or 1,300 a year that are killed by law enforcement in this country. That is already so problematic, and that you are going to then further empower this institution that has proven to you every single day that it cannot be effective and in fact does more harm than good. You're then going to further empower it with AI, with algorithms and all this kind of stuff. Absurd, obscene. We should put our foot down. We should not accept this. This is deeply problematic. We need to have these conversations. I'm glad that Mr. Williams was freed. I'm not glad that he had to spend almost an entire life of his, an entire year of his life in fucking jail. You cannot get that time back. He was close to taking his life, you guys. He was in his 60s. He was like, I'm fucking done. I mean, this is tragic stuff, and it needs to be addressed immediately. This should be part of our discussions about police as an institution and what we need to do to create a better institution in their place. So tech in law enforcement and in prosecutions, huge problem. We need to have this discussion in a more robust way than I have seen thus far. We've covered a little bit about Andrew Cuomo, who resigned in shame over sexual harassment and assault allegations, and additionally is facing scrutiny for his contributing to thousands of deaths with his nursing home policy and with his other mishandlings of the COVID pandemic, though he, as I continually will mention, writes a self-aggrandizing book about his leadership while he was fucking this thing up every which way to Sunday. Had his aides helping him write that book while they were helping him falsify numbers about how many people in nursing homes died. Andrew Cuomo has to resign in shame. Well, we've covered a little bit about how Chris Cuomo of CNN, in fact, one of CNN's flagship hosts, though that is relative. They've been getting horrible ratings lately to my, to my happiness, I suppose, whatever the opposite of chagrin is. And there's something about Chris here that I think is worth reporting. Chris has tried to say that he handled this in an acceptable way, that he stopped covering his brother because there was a conflict of interest. But Chris does not like to mention that he had his brother on damn near daily at the beginning of this pandemic, when Andrew was being treated with reverence, when the media was fawning over him and glorifying him instead of covering him critically. Chris had no problem having him on daily to glorify his brother, to joke about how big his nose is, and crack inside family jokes and this and that, make him look all, humanize him, all this kind of stuff, right? No problem doing that. That didn't violate Chris Cuomo's ethics. That didn't violate his journalistic integrity. Only once his brother was in trouble did he say, well, it just wouldn't be right for me to bring him on. It wouldn't be right for me to talk about it. I can't. CNN says I can't. So he's been a massive hypocrite on this. And then he came out at the end of his show, one of the days earlier this week, and just outright lied about this shit. So I'm going to show you guys a short clip here of Chris Cuomo lying his ass off about this whole situation, and then we'll come back and discuss.
It's never easy being in this business and coming from a political family, especially now. This situation is unlike anything I could have imagined. And yet I know what matters at work and at home. Everyone knows you support your family. I know and appreciate that you get that. But you should also know I never covered my brother's troubles because I obviously have a conflict. And there are rules at CNN about that. I said last year that his appearances on this show would be short-lived. And they were. The last was over a year ago, long before any kind of scandal. I also said back then that a day would come when he would have to be held to account, and I can't do that. I said point blank, I can't be objective when it comes to my family. So I never reported on the scandal. And when it happened, I tried to be there for my brother. I'm not an advisor. I'm a brother. I wasn't in control of anything. I was there to listen and offer my take. And my advice to my brother was simple and consistent. Own what you did. Tell people what you'll do to be better. Be contrite. And finally, accept that it doesn't matter what you intended. What matters is how your actions and words were perceived. And yes, while it was something I never imagined ever having to do, I did urge my brother to resign when the time came. There are stories and critics saying all kinds of things about me, many unsupported. But know this, my position has never changed. I never misled anyone about the information I was delivering or not delivering on this program. I never attacked nor encouraged anyone to attack any woman who came forward. I never made calls to the press about my brother's situation. I never influenced or attempted to control CNN's coverage of my family. And as you know, back in May, when I was told to no longer communicate with my brother's aides in any group meetings, I acknowledged it was a mistake. I apologized to my colleagues, and I stopped, and I meant it. It was a unique situation being a brother to a politician in a scandal and being part of the media. I tried to do the right thing, and I just want you all to know that. As I've said, we have rules here at CNN that prevent me from reporting on my brother. They remain in place and will continue to. Tonight, I simply wanted to address something that, given what's happened, I just felt it needed to be said. This will be my final word on it, and I appreciate you giving me the opportunity to do so.
So where do you even start with that? I mean, seriously, the entire few minutes I just showed you was nothing but lies, nothing but falsehoods, nothing but misrepresenting what actually happened. Let's start with his saying he was objective. Okay, you can't have your brother on because of objectivity, but you have no problem having him on to glorify him. That's the polar opposite of objective. You're only having him on in the good times, not in the bad times. That is exactly the opposite of objective. Outright lie. He says, CNN has a policy against this. Well, it's funny. CNN didn't have a policy about you glorifying him, did they? They didn't have a problem with you bringing him on your show to help him sell his fucking books, did they, Chris? That didn't violate objectivity. No problem there. It's only once things hit the fan. Once shit hits the fan. Now you can't cover him. CNN policy. Sorry, objectivity. Outright lie. Misrepresenting the truth. He says, I was not an advisor. This is just brazenly false. He was talking not just to his brother. He was talking to his brother's attorneys and aides and advisors. He himself helped write one of the press releases in response to these scandals. And in that press release, it deflected and did not apologize or come off as contrite, like Chris wanted you to believe there. He says, I told him to be contrite and own up to what he did. No, you didn't. And we have the records to prove this. You helped him write a press release that deflected the blame, that obfuscated from this entire situation. Chris Cuomo is an outright liar trying to make himself look good. And then he comes out and he wants credit for his brother's resignation. I told him that he should resign. Oh, fuck off. This is media being as egregious as media can be. This is the insidership to the highest possible degree. This is pompousness and arrogance and narcissism and nepotism to the highest possible degree. Shame on the Cuomos, both of them, and shame on Chris for coming out with this outright lie. Shame on CNN for platforming him and continuing to platform him after he has demonstrated to you what little journalistic ethics he actually will abide by. This is all false. Everything you just saw is false, and this is how the media operates, and you should probably know that. So shame on Chris Cuomo and shame on Andrew Cuomo. The world will be better without that man in the governor's mansion, and the world would be better if Chris Cuomo would retire from media, okay? That's all I have to say about that. I wanted to talk briefly about the Capitol bomb threats. Obviously, I'm sure a number of you saw, I'm blanking on the guy's name, but he sat in a truck or a van outside of the Library of Congress and held a container, I don't know how to quite put it, like a bucket thing, a drum that he claimed was full of gunpowder, and that if they tried to shoot him, they would risk blowing up a couple of city blocks. He finally ends up surrendering to authorities. He says there were 3 patriots, Southern patriots, he said, in the DC area who were ready to give their lives for this patriotic cause. He was spewing a bunch of right-wing talking points, but he also mentioned, and I wish I would have queued this video up for you guys to see, but I'm sure many of you have seen it. He also mentioned that part of what he was aggrieved by was our healthcare system. He said he was sick of our healthcare system and not having healthcare provided to him. So here's an individual who has been so misled by the media as to be a right-wing propagandist idiot, but whose grievances really should point him to the left. If you want healthcare, you should be out there marching with us on July 24th for single-payer healthcare. If you really want healthcare, you should have been a Bernie Sanders supporter. You should be a leftist. And I really want to drive home, you guys, that these issues, many of them, cross party lines, even if it doesn't appear overtly as though they do. Some half of Republicans are in favor of a universal healthcare system, of single-payer healthcare, Medicare for all. So this is an issue that a lot of these, the right-wing extremism that we are starting to see pop up in the country, a lot of it is born in our unwillingness to take care of our constituents and our civilians and our people. We refuse to provide them with basic needs like housing and food and education and healthcare. We just refuse steadfastly. Now, that gets twisted in their minds into sort of buying into some of the Trumpian and Fox News and Breitbart and PragerU conspiracy theories. And that's what this guy clearly fell into. On a side note, it was hilarious. I saw Fox. They literally said, no word yet on his motives. The guy was live streaming on Facebook, spewing a bunch of right-wing nonsense that came apparently straight from Fox News. And they're sitting there going, no word yet on his motives. We're not sure why the guy was doing what he was doing. Utterly absurd. But the point I'm trying to make is that when you take care of people in a fundamental sense, you also can help avoid some of these conspiratorial views and extremism in this form. People will be less likely to believe in conspiratorial nonsense and less likely to act on it if they have their basic needs met. We need to get to a point where we take care of everybody and everybody has a floor that is reasonable so that they can engage in society and learn, and you know what I mean, not fall into these buckets of conspiracy theories because they are so aggrieved by the policy decisions made by the powers that be. So I just wanted to touch on that very briefly. I'm sure it will be blown out of proportion by the mainstream media. They love to hop on anything that has a scent of Trump. We'll see how that gets covered. I'm glad he didn't blow up a city block. I'm glad he was taken in alive instead of dead. I'm sure that if he was black, he would have been shot and killed, and they'd have blown the block up anyway. But I'm glad that the situation resolved itself peacefully. I would like people to focus on the fact that this guy was so adamant about healthcare being one of his grievances. We need to take care of our citizens in a way that we currently simply do not. So those who followed my old channel know that I have particular contempt for a certain group of grifters that go by the Lincoln Project. This is a bunch of right-wing war criminals, corrupt, multimillionaires, advisors to Republican presidents, etc., who saw a grifting opportunity. And I don't use that word lightly. I think that the term grift and grifter get overused in today's society. These are like textbook grifters. So that's how I'm going to refer to them. The Lincoln Project has had innumerable revelations about how they're spending all of the money that they bring in from MSNBC liberals, nearly $100 million in donations at this point, I might add. And it comes down to basically them pocketing it. They give a lot of this money to firms that are owned by or partially owned by their co-founders, or that their co-founders are on the board of, these kinds of things. They also now have been caught basically spending a lot of their donations on their legal team to defend the organization over the claims about why am I thinking Jeff Weaver? What's his name? John Weaver? Shit. Totally blanking on the guy's name. One of their co-founders. It's something Weaver. I think it's John. Anyway, not Jeff, Bernie's advisor. I think it's John Weaver. Anyway, this guy was grooming men, young men, boys. A lot of them were underage. And this story sort of slowly came out. It apparently was one of those things that people in DC knew was happening, but no one would say. And then finally an outlet got enough to report it. Well, there were leaks from the Lincoln Project, email leaks, that demonstrated that the organization at the top level knew what was going on well before they did anything about it. So before they actually let Weaver go, they knew full well what he was doing, and there were emails discussing how they were going to handle that. That's the quality of this organization. Just out and out horrific individuals. Do not donate to the Lincoln Project, you guys. You're just giving to conservative grifters whose end goal, by the way, is very clearly to drag things to the right. They want to earn the trust of Democratic voters and liberals and leftists by slamming Trump. And then they want to turn around and drag narratives back to the right, which is where all of these people actually stand. Okay. Anyhow, I have a tweet thread here from Rob Pyers, who goes over some of the recent financial revelations. And recent, it was like a month ago. This was July 30th. I somehow missed this story, but I wanted to make sure to bring it to you guys. So Rob says, mid-year FEC report shows at least some donors have forgiven the Lincoln Project for the pederasty enabling, that's Weaver, obviously, and the wholesale grifting in the pursuit of generational wealth transgressions, contributing $4.8 million to the scandal-plagued group. This is the most recent that they've gotten, $4.8 million. While Lincoln Project brought in $4.8 million, the operating expenses of $8.5 million suggest there might be an incipient panicked rush for the exits, with everyone involved grabbing everything that isn't nailed down on the way out. Lincoln Project spent $1.37 million on non-political media buys, $1.12 million on its streaming services, and paid over $964,000 on legal fees and $610,000 on communication consulting as it struggled to repair its battered reputation. Outside of the media buys and streaming, the biggest recipient of Lincoln Project cash was Impartial Partners, an anonymously registered Albany, New York LLC that formed in May, that is probably definitely not a vehicle for someone wishing to accumulate generational wealth. I just absolutely love that is probably definitely not a vehicle for someone wishing to accumulate generational wealth. I would love to see who actually started this LLC and who is benefiting from it, because I can almost assure you that it is Lincoln Project, co-founders and things of this nature. He goes on, other outlays, $410,000 to Summit Strategic, 324.7 thousand to Tusk, and he lists the names here which are associated with the Lincoln Project next to it. 248.4 to Third Act Media, 173.8 to Nate Nesbitt, 115,000 Message Mountain to Stu Stevens, 889,000 to Veracity, 55 to Kurt Bardella, 50 to Joe Trippi, 25 to Steve Schmidt. Steve Schmidt is one of their co-founders and was a close advisor to George W. Bush. Going on here, it remains unclear how many more Benjamins are flowing through the Franklin Project, the dark money offshoot formerly known as Project Yellowstone, again associated with the Lincoln Project. While Lincoln Project was very adept at shielding the cash transfers to some of its more problematic members by routing the payments through intermediaries, public tax records suggest that the Lincoln Project members probably made out okay. And they link an article here. John Weaver, I was right, it's John. Disgraced Lincoln Project founder John Weaver paid off his $1.4 million mortgage significantly quicker than he was expected to. Next one here with John Weaver's $1.4 million mortgage paid off. Here you go, 27 years early. He probably doesn't need to worry about having to move and the reintroducing himself to the new neighbors that would entail now that he's a sexual predator. While its political spending track record was mixed at best, Lincoln Project excelled at persuading its audience of resist donors to part with $99.6 million of their money, burning through $47.1 million on operating expenditures and independent expenditures, supposedly totaling $49.7 million. So huge chunks of this money are just going to operating costs. Guys, what does that mean? That means firms that their founders and people associated with them are also associated with. So they're just grifting. They're just taking your money to be like Trump bad. Great example of this. During the heat of the election, they went and put a billboard up in New York. They spent a whole bunch of money on a billboard in New York City. Now, if you actually want to affect an election in favor of the Democrats, if that's actually their true goal to stop Trump, what are you doing advertising in one of the states that you're already assured to win? What they were clearly doing is going after the people who are paying them. They were going after the MSNBC liberals saying, give us your money so we can give it to consulting firms that we own or are invested in, right? Give us your money and then trust us. So when we tell you we should stay in Afghanistan, you'll believe us, right? See, we're lefties now. This was clearly a grift through and through, and an attempt at moving narratives to the right. You should not support Rick Wilson or John Weaver or Steve Schmidt or any of these pieces of fucking trash. Do not support them financially, rhetorically, anything. They're awful. They're grifters through and through, and I just cannot say enough. That, you know, I don't have enough words in my vocabulary to properly express my contempt for this fucking organization. Okay, do not support the Lincoln Project. A couple of more stories here, you guys. Biden administration has done a couple rounds of canceling some portion of student debt. Now, this is not me complimenting Biden, because he is picking and choosing very specific things, specific ways in which he will forgive certain portions of the debt, and it's not nearly enough. I'm covering this because I want to point out the Biden administration has previously taken the line that they do not have the authority to cancel large portions of student debt. They've now admitted in their actions that they know that's a lie. So here we have a CBS News article covering the latest. Biden administration automatically erasing student debt for borrowers with severe disabilities. The Biden administration will automatically wipe out federal student loan debt for borrowers who have a total and permanent disability, as it has done for veterans with a severe disability, meaning more than 323,000 borrowers who have received more than $5.8 billion in automatic student loan discharges. The federal government currently allows for the elimination of federal student loan repayments for those identified as having a total and permanent disability, but the Education Department's new rule would nix application paperwork and make the debt elimination automatic for borrowers who are already identified as having a total and permanent disability through the Social Security Administration. The Education Department also says it will try to eliminate the 3-year monitoring period in which borrowers' debt could be reinstated if they do not respond to requests for income information. So again, this is in their actions, them admitting that their excuse to do nothing about this thus far was an absolute lie. This is just like when they said, we don't have the authority to continue the eviction moratorium. And then Cory Bush camped outside of Congress, and then they went, oh, wait, we do. They just fucking lie. They think they can pass, blame onto the parliamentarian or procedural bullshit, and that we're just all stupid enough to believe it. Cancel it all, Joe. What are you doing? You've now admitted that your only excuse not to is complete bullshit. Cancel it all. Again, this is a very tiny step in the right direction. Obviously, I do not want severely disabled people to be stuck with student debt, but I do not want anybody stuck with student debt. Joe Biden should do the right thing, which he has just admitted he is perfectly capable of doing, and cancel this debt for everybody. And one more story here that I think is very, very important. This is about the gig economy and how we are moving towards an economy that, a system that is less favorable to workers. This is in Jacobin. Gig companies are bringing the disastrous Prop 22 to a state near you. The gig companies, fresh from their Prop 22 victory in California, are seeking to repeat their success in Massachusetts, pushing a ballot measure that would strip app-based drivers of existing labor protections like the minimum wage. So-called gig companies rely on one big innovation, breaking the law, or to put it more politely, labor arbitrage. Rather than taking on the expenses, the minimum wage, for example, and risk overtime liabilities for injuries and accidents on the job that come with employing people, they declare them independent contractors, shifting responsibility onto the drivers who make a living carrying out the company's core functions. Uber and Lyft, which nonetheless still do not turn a profit, enter new areas, floating on a cloud of venture capital and plow that money into enticing people into using their services. Public transit is underfunded, and these companies offer a private sector alternative. Prices are kept low at first, with VC money subsidizing the operation, allowing the service and its model of worker exploitation to become a part of daily life. So this is a common trick, you guys, that gig companies have started to use. They claim they do not need to live up to labor laws and standards and minimum wage laws and things like this if they classify these workers as independent contractors. Okay, they spent millions of dollars in California ensuring that Prop 22 passed in favor of Uber and Lyft. Now they're taking that same kind of bill to Massachusetts, and I have no doubt that they intend to take it anywhere that they can. We need to stand firmly in opposition to this gig economy. We need to stand with workers, with labor organizers, etc. And this should be one of our top priorities in terms of domestic policy. We also, I just want to note, a federal job guarantee would take care of so much of this, you guys, because they would be forced to meet the same standard that the job guarantee offered in compensation, in workplace conditions, in time off, benefits, etc. Okay, you would automatically set a floor that none of these companies could go below, whether they want to call you employees or contractors. All right. A lot of these drivers also end up making less than it even appears on paper because they have to pay for their own gas and pay for their own maintenance on their car and all this kind of stuff. So this is exploitative nonsense, just like with the OnlyFans stuff that we talked about earlier, just like the Nabisco situation, the strike that we talked about earlier that's happening across the country, or at least in a handful of locations across the country. We need to combat, fearlessly combat and steadfastly combat the exploitation of the capitalist class of workers, and we need to combat their attempts to classify these workers in ways that allow them to skirt labor laws and protections. Shame on Uber and Lyft. We should put a lot into these campaigns and making sure that states don't pass anything similar to Prop 22. Really want to thank you guys for tuning in today. I think we covered a lot of important topics, and I was glad to bring you Jabari, Jodi, and Steve, a few of my colleagues at Real Progressives. Want to make sure you guys are going to realprogressives.org to find all of our content, articles, videos, podcasts, etc. Our Patreon is also there if you'd like to donate to our work. Follow us on both of our YouTube channels, Real Progressives and Real Progress in Action. Follow us on Twitter at Real Progress US, at RP_in_action. I am at Luke Parcher Show if you want to follow me there as well. Thank you guys so much for tuning in today, and I will see you next week.